Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.
You have to have the facts, and you can't tell the people.
Hello, this is Nick Pope, and you're listening to the Paranormal UK radio network, the UK's biggest paranormal network. And this is Paranormal Dimensions with David Young.
Hello, and welcome to another show. And thank you for that intro, Nick. Okay, today may be a little bit controversial. I've got a great guest on today who doesn't believe we went to the moon, so we'll be talking a lot about the moon today. We'll also be talking about aliens on the moon. Have they been there in the past? So it should be quite a lively debate. I think the main part of the topic is going to be, have we ever been to the moon? Myself, I do believe we have been to the moon. My guest, Marcus Allen, seems to think that we didn't go to the moon, and he seems to have a lot of evidence that supports that. It is kind of out of the realms of the paranormal, but because of the aliens on the moon aspect of it, and maybe some of his other beliefs, that we can bring that into it. I can't prove we went to the moon. I can only go by what I've experienced and what I've seen on the television and everything else over the years, is the same as everybody else. And so let's waste no more time. Let's get Marcus on. Hello, Marcus. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, David. It's very good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Well, I'll be looking forward to this one.
Long time no speak, as they say.
I know. It's amazing how these shows, they seem to be quite a long way off, and then suddenly they're upon you. You know.
I know. It's been building up for weeks now, this one.
No. Anyway, it's great to speak to you at last again. I don't know if you remember the last time I saw you. Actually, I mean, I've seen you on the stage a couple of times, but we've never really sort of got together or met and everything. Apart from when I think you walked into the bar when I was sitting with Nick and Eric von Daniken and Mike Burrow, and I could see you were looking at me and thinking, who the hell is he?
Where have I seen him before, I was thinking? He's obviously a very important person.
Well,
Look
no,
who
not really.
Surrounded by. I'm just going to speak to him.
No, I'll tell you what it was, because I'd spoken to Nick. I've been talking to Nick quite a lot about the Larry Warren affair, you know. And also with Eric von Daniken, I'd met him a couple of times previous, and funny enough, he was staying in that same hotel as I was. And when I arrived to check in, they were actually sitting in the lobby ready to go to the meeting hall. And,
really?
and as I walked in, I was like, oh, Nick and Eric, you know. Yeah. And the most amazing thing for me on that occasion was Eric said to me, because I said to him, oh, I'm David, you may not remember. He said, no, I remember you. And that sort of blew my mind, that did.
That's very good. Yeah.
Because, for someone of his stature, because he's always been a bit of a hero of mine, Eric. I mean, you probably know him better than I do, but he's probably one of the people. He is one of the people that got me set off on this road in the first place, through Chariots of the Gods and everything.
I know, it's great. It's great. But as I say, thank you for inviting me, because it's something that I think we've spoken about in the past.
Yes.
And you've seen me do a couple of presentations.
I definitely have, and it fascinates me. I'm going to admit to you now, I still find it very, very hard to accept that we didn't go to the moon, right? I've grown up with it. I wasn't there, but I remember it happening in '69, and before that with Apollo 8 and everything. And I still can't get my head around that we didn't go. I mean, I've been to like the Houston Space Center and everything. with a VIP pass, done all the back, walked all around where the astronauts train, and even where they're eaten, and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's something that I'm hoping that you will convince me, perhaps when we get into this a little bit. But I'll tell you what, before we set off,
okay.
I in my intro, I didn't say anything about you, but you actually are the producer of Nexus magazine, aren't you?
I'm the publisher in the UK and Europe.
Yes.
Now,
I didn't realise, but it actually started off in Australia, didn't it?
Oh yeah, well, it's still edited there. That's where it's produced. The editor is called Duncan Rhodes, and he's lived in Australia all his life. Well, he was born in the UK. He was born in East Anglia.
Right.
And he emigrated with his family out to Tasmania when he was about 5 or 6. And they wanted to set up a sort of community based on the principles that the Findhorn community had put together. Findhorn up in Scotland, which they did. They created a farm under the principles that the Findhorn founders created, and that was run for many years. Duncan was brought up on the farm there, and eventually it was sold. His father is Michael Rhodes, who's the author of quite a few, shall we say, interesting books. Michael Rhodes. So Duncan's his son, and Duncan set up Nexus magazine about 1986 was set up, and Duncan took it over when the original founder of Nexus magazine decided he was going to go and do something else. So Duncan got left with the magazine. It was then based in Sydney, and he moved it up to Queensland, where it still is now, about 2 hours drive north of Brisbane. It's a beautiful part of the country, and he's been running it ever since.
All right, so you've actually been over there, have you?
Yes, I went over there. In fact, the story of how I got involved is quite interesting. I used to work for Toyota GB. That's the car importer of Toyota cars.
Right, yep.
In the UK. I was an area manager with them.
Right. I had a couple of Toyotas. They're good cars.
They are very good cars. I still drive one today. And I've been with them for 17 years. I was an area manager. I enjoyed the job. I had a company car and all the rest of it. It was a good company to work for. And one day they decided they were actually taken over in the early 90s by the Japanese parent company, Toyota Motor Sales, TMS, they're called. And they decided to reorganize the management structure of Toyota GB. And I was one of the casualties of that. 25 people were made redundant. I happened to be one of them. And, it's the standard thing. It's, give you a big check and tell you to get lost. Which is fine. And fortunately, with the big check, I was able to decide that, I could sell cars or bits of cars. That was my job. How hard would it be to sell magazines? Because I'd come across Nexus magazine down in Glastonbury, as one does, and thought, well, if I like it, maybe other people will like it. I was looking for something to do at that time, and I thought, well, let's see if we can find out anything about it. So I went out to Australia, met up with the editor, and he said, well, I've been thinking about wanting to distribute in the UK, so if you're interested, go for it.
Right.
Here are a few back copies. Here are something to get you started with. So I landed back at Heathrow with 50 kilos of excess baggage, which was my spare stock of magazines, and set about trying to sell them, because I thought, well, people are going to be interested. So where do you sell magazines? Oh, W.H. Smith, that's where you sell magazines. Yeah. So I phoned W.H. Smith up and said, I've got this magazine, do you want to sell it? And they said, who's your distributor? I said, I am. They said, no, you're not. And then I found out, actually, it's not quite as simple as I thought it was. There are specialist companies who distribute magazines. Because when you think about it, you go into W.H. Smith or any decent newsagent and you look on the magazine shelf, how do they all get there? In the quantities that they are? Because you never see, well, except quite recently we have, but you very seldom see magazine shelves that are empty. And that is all to do with the amount of magazines that are ordered by the distributors to go into the various outlets. There are 700 W.H. Smith outlets. Headings at High Street, obviously that's obvious. Then there's W.H. Smith Travel, which is airports and train stations and channel tunnels, people like that. And they all have a special representative from the distributors of the various magazines, and they decide how many they're going to sell on each of these outlets. And that's how I got started. And that was 25 years ago. Wow. we've been on news agents ever since. So Nexus magazine is, people say, well, what is it? If you haven't seen a copy of Nexus magazine, well, what I say it's like a cross between The Economist, The New Scientist, 40 Times, and Private Eye.
Yeah, and Times magazine, it reminds me a little bit of sometimes.
Which one?
Time magazine.
Oh yes. Because
it's in that sort of genre, isn't it? Usually, if you see like the Time magazine, it'd be sitting on the shelf in amongst those types of magazines.
It does, yes, and like Foreign Affairs. That's the other one. That's the one. And basically, Nexus covers 6 major subjects, which are alternative health, hidden history, who built the pyramids, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What's happening in the Amazon basin, where the people there, that's hidden history. Future science, and there's some very interesting stuff going on in future science. 0 point energy, have you heard of that?
No, I can't say I have. I'd be lying if I said I did.
0 point energy will be the replacement for fossil fuels.
Oh, right.
It's already in action. There are power stations producing 0 point. It's basically energy from the atmosphere. 0 point refers to the 0 point where everything stops moving.
Right. So the fossil fuel companies are not going to be very happy about all that, are they?
Oh, of course they're not. But that's the way things change. Literally 150 years ago, there were reports in the Times, I think it was, 1866 it was, there were reports saying that if at the present rate of consumption we continue to use coal, we'll run out of coal in 30 years. That was in 1866.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we know what happened. Coal was superseded by oil. Oil is going to be superseded by the next development. And I think that development is 0 point energy. Check out 0 point energy. It's not rocket science. This is a real physical thing. So if you've got at 0 point, all molecular activity ceases. That's 270 degrees, minus 270 degrees Kelvin. That's absolute zero. But the thing that doesn't stop moving are the electrons in atoms. If you can tap into that, and the person who originally tapped into it was Nikola Tesla, back in the late 19th century, he was trying to demonstrate the wireless transmission of energy. And the same way that today you get television signals transmitted, radio signals transmitted, not to anybody in particular, but if you have a receiver, you can collect those signals and see what the pictures are.
Yeah.
Same with 0 point energy. If you have a receiver, which looks remarkably similar to a television receiving aerial, plug it into the right equipment, and you can light bulbs with it.
Right. Now,
literally,
is this energy going to be free? That's the big question, Mark, because that was the idea of Nikola Tesla all those years ago, wasn't it? That it was going to be free energy.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, it should be, but there will still be the necessity for companies to produce the equipment that will generate it. But it's not going to be in the same context as oil, which is used to drive internal combustion engines or to drive power stations. The equipment used in that is separate from the fuel used to do it. So the 0 point energy, which actually is free, it's free energy in terms that it doesn't cost anything to produce it. I mean, nobody has to dig it out of the ground or refine it in any way. It's just absorbed out of the atmosphere. The atmosphere is full of energy if we tap into it. What is going to cost money is the equipment to produce it, to generate the electricity in our homes. Because you could have a 5 kilowatt transformer, a 5 kilowatt generator in your home to run your house. If you get a 100 kilowatt or 200 kilowatt generator in your car to drive your car, stick it off. It's one of the things that Nikola Tesla actually demonstrated. Yeah. Pulling energy out of the atmosphere, powering a car with it. So that's the future. So let's not get too overexcited about fossil fuels. They're on their way out.
So when do you think that will actually take the hold? Are we talking about 20 years, 25 years?
It's already in action now.
Yeah, but but actually taking hold in the general.
It's going to take time because the point you made earlier, which is very valid, the people are going to get upset about it. The oil companies are not going to give up their monopoly that easily. Yeah. So it's going to require a political, not intervention, but political, a political intervention to ensure that one set of problems that produced by fossil fuels is diminished, and the new set of activity, zero-point energy, is introduced. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people who are going to be made unemployed at that point. These have to be managed, and that is the job of politicians, to manage it. And if they don't step up to the plate and manage it and do it properly, introduce the new technology in an efficient way, it's going to cause a lot of problems. We don't want to have problems. We don't want sort of problems.
Yeah, I can see something like all the money goes into very few pockets, and everyone else not making anything out of it. Well, like many things are today.
That's the way things are today, but that doesn't mean to say it's always going to be that way. Things will change.
Well, let's hope not. I mean, I'm sure it'll be after my time anyway.
Yes, I mean, as I say, zero-point energy is already in use. I can't say where it's in use because I've been asked not to publicise that, but it is in use. A 10 megawatt power station is already in operation.
Wow.
Now 10 megawatts is big.
Very interesting.
It's already in operation, so watch this space. We'll keep you as informed as possible. As I say, there are certain restrictions on the amount of information that I can give out right now. It doesn't mean to say it's not available, it's just I've given my word that I would not publicise specifically, say where it's being done, because, these things have to be developed quietly, gently, which is what's happening. There are people who are working on it. So let's let them get on.
Yeah.
Saying that's one of the areas that the Nexus magazine covers.
Yeah. And I've actually got it in front of me. It says also you do a lot of the unexplained and UFOs, which is obviously what this show covers mostly, paranormal experiences. So that would be of an interest. I mean, hopefully when the show goes out on Monday, I'll put a link to your magazine up on the page, on the Paranormal Dimensions page on Facebook, and people can come and see, come to the link that I'll put on there, and maybe get some more magazine. You'll get some more magazine sales out of it. It's already been selling in 100 countries, isn't it, including the USA and Canada? So it must be doing pretty well.
Oh, it is. It's well, from the UK we send out to 35 countries. Australia send out right across the Pacific Islands, right across Southeast Asia. I mean, it's well received around the world. In fact, a few years ago I got a phone call from somebody because they want to renew their subscription, and occasionally I get chatting to them and say, what do you do, where you live? And they said, I work for Scotland Yard. I thought, woo, I work for Scotland Yard. They said, yes, I work in the legal department of Scotland Yard. He said, we like your magazine. Where else would we get so much good information in one place? Keep going.
Yeah.
We like it.
Oh, it is a quality magazine. It's not like some of the like the Today magazine or anything like that. It's actually very well printed and on quality paper, isn't it? So
yeah. Well, it's printed on what's called newsprint rather than the sort of glossy magazine stuff, because people don't like the glossy covering of newspapers in magazines because it flashes in them and they can't read it. So we publish on newsprint. When we first did it, I asked Duncan, I said, why do you publish on newsprint? And he said, it's very simple. He said, in Australia and in America, magazines are distributed by air. In Europe, they're distributed by road, so the weight of a magazine is unimportant. In America and Australia, the weight of a magazine is very important because that's the cost of the distribution.
Sure.
So basically we just continue doing it that way until somebody complains, and nobody's complained yet, so we just carry on.
Is there an electronic copy of it that you can get electronic downloads of it, or is it?
Yes. It's just go on to nexusmagazine.com website, and you can order either an electronic download or a hard copy download, or if you want both, you can get both.
Yeah, because I suppose it goes on the Kindle, does it?
Yes, it goes on Kindle. It goes on to most of the platforms. You can download it to your, computer if you want to. And alongside Nexus Magazine, there is what's called the Nexus Newsfeed.com, which produces every day 15 different articles from around the world on various subjects, whether it's ancient aliens, ancient archaeology, future science, all the sort of unexplained areas covered pretty well. So if you're listening to David's show, Nexus Magazine is your companion piece for when you're not listening to him.
Excellent, yeah. Good plug there.
Thank you.
But I will put a link to it on anyway. I suppose we ought to get down to the nitty gritty now while you're on the show. Now, let's go. Now, Marcus, you are quite adamant that we didn't go to the moon.
Absolutely. No human has landed on the moon.
Well,
there you go.
Yep. Now, I've already explained to you, I mean, I'm not here to argue with you. I find that very, very difficult to accept because I was born in 1950. I sort of grew up the space race. I saw what I believed they landed on the moon. I still believe they landed on the moon. I don't believe that NASA tell us the entire truth, about everything. But I still do believe they went to the moon. But I'm open to be persuaded otherwise. I've seen your presentation before, in various places and you've been on several TV shows and things, like you've been on BBC TV, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky News, Sky Sci-Fi, Discovery Channels, all, again, anything you could mention, and you always put up a very, very good argument, and one that really someone the likes of me or anyone out there can't really argue with, because we don't get access to NASA itself. You see what I'm saying? It's not an easy thing for me to come out and say I can prove otherwise, because I can't.
Well, I would say, you made quite a strong case there that you generally, excuse me, you genuinely believe that that man has landed on the moon. So what would you put forward in support of that contention?
Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you what. Let's go right back to the beginning of. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that NASA has a secret space program?
I've seen I have not seen enough evidence to say that I think they have. What I will say is that many people who contend that there is a secret space program confuse the Anglia TV program called Alternative 3 and the book of the same name by David Watkins with the secret space program, because it is a very persuasive book. It was a very good TV. It was a real TV program. You can buy it. It's produced by Sony, I think it is. And they appeared to show that there had been landings on the moon and on Mars back in the early 1960s. Now, as I say, it's called Alternative 3, and that is based on a concept of global warming.
Right.
How do you deal with global warming if it is as much of a problem as it is alleged to be? How do you deal with it? So one of the first suggestions was, well, you create a hole in the upper atmosphere and let the heat out. And that was actually done in 1962, called Operation Starfish Prime, where literally, get this, nuclear bombs were exploded 250 miles off the coast, above the island, Johnson Island in the Pacific. It's for real. Nuclear bombs in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And then the Americans having done it, the Russians did the same thing in Siberia, a 1.4 megaton bomb. It's huge. In the upper atmosphere. Right, obviously that didn't let the heat out, so they had to come up with another solution. So Alternative 2 was create underground cities that the elite could be taken to when it became uninhabitable to live on the surface. And that has happened. there are underground cities, there are underground places,
Yeah, I
but
believe
not,
that, yeah.
Cheyenne Mountain is a good example of one. There are plenty of places, Cappadocia in Turkey is an underground city. It's many thousands of years old. Anyway, they couldn't build them fast enough, so there weren't enough places, so they had to come up with Alternative 3, which is what the book and the film is about. Alternative 3 implies that there is a secret space program where scientists are being flown to the moon anonymously, because that's how it all came out. A scientist who was supposed to have emigrated to America, this is the time of the brain drain in the early 1970s, emigrated to America, and their family wanted to contact them. But they couldn't find them. They couldn't get any response. And they found out that they'd literally disappeared. As it turned out, they'd gone to the moon. And then on to Mars, to terraform Mars to create a planet that humans could inhabit. And there are some very persuasive pieces of film produced in the program showing activity on the Martian surface. So that's where a lot of the idea of the secret space program seems to originate from. There may be other aspects to the secret space program as well, but I tend to stick to the space program that we know about.
Yeah.
NASA's, never a straight answer.
That's right, yeah. I really do think that NASA don't tell us everything that goes on, and I do think they do keep a lot of secrets, and they do actually, I won't call it lying, but maybe don't quite tell us the full truth of what's happening. But the reason I was asking about the secret space program and your opinion of it is, I mean, let's put it, do you believe that there are aliens that have been to our moon?
I think the aliens live inside the moon.
You do believe that? Yeah.
It's the obvious place for them to live.
Yeah.
Now, all right, let's take that a step further. Is the moon artificial? Could it have been deliberately placed in its current orbit? Because the moon's orbit is really extraordinary when you think about it. The moon keeps one face towards Earth at all times. How do you get out? People will just explain it as being a tidal lock on the Earth. But what the moon does is to balance the Earth. It stops the Earth getting out of control. Because if take the moon away, what would happen? Well, most people say, well, there won't be any tides, which is correct. There won't be. So if the moon, let's say the moon was placed in its current orbit deliberately to ensure that the conditions on Earth were conducive to life as we know it. If that had happened, it's logical to assume that whoever did it would want to keep an eye on what was going on, because obviously activity on Earth is of great interest to anybody creating it. It's rather like a zoo. One wants to make sure the animals are all right. So you live nearby, so you can keep an eye on it. So if the moon is artificial, could it be hollow? If it's hollow, could that be where E.T. lives? And comes and goes out of the far side? It's not called the dark side, by the way. That's the record by Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
It's the far side of the moon, because it receives as much sunlight as the near side, the bit we can see, because of its orbit. But when you consider that the moon can eclipse the sun precisely, not 99%, not 101%, it's 100% eclipse. It's an extraordinary event when you see it. It's almost...
Yeah, when you think of it like that, it does seem weird, I've got to admit.
Yeah. It's almost as if whoever created that thing was to say, well, when you guys down on Earth are intelligent enough to spot this and work out what we've done, you might be in a position to understand things a little bit better.
Yeah, because you've got the moon that's 93 million miles away, roughly, and the moon is 250,000 miles, I think. And for those to actually line up perfectly from our viewpoint, it's I'd never actually thought of that. You've given me something to think about already, Marcus.
It's an extraordinary conjunction, and then you start getting into the diameter of the moon, which is 2,160 miles. compared to the diameter of the Earth, which is 7,954 miles. And if you look at those diameters, that is the exact, it's, hang on a minute, divide one into the other and you get pi, 3.142. It's the calculation of pi, the diameter, the ratio of the diameter of the circle to its circumference. If you take the diameter of the moon as 9, hang on, let's get this right. It's basically pi is 22 divided by 7. That's 3.142. And if you extrapolate up from the current diameter to the current diameter of the Earth, you get the same proportions. The moon is 3.67. The Earth is 3.67 times the size, the apparent size of the moon. There are remarkable figures that one can extrapolate out of the diameter and the circumference of the moon, the circumference of its orbit, circumference of the Earth's orbit. These are things all known about by the ancients. So we're talking 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. You know, in the same way that the pyramid defines the Great Pyramid. That's as you look at them, you've got one with a little cap of rock at the top, and then you've got a smaller one on the left, and the Great Pyramid is the one on the right. And just looking at those, at the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, the circumference of the Great Pyramid divided by the height will give you pi. How do they know that?
Yeah.
And how many people know that the Great Pyramid is not a 4-sided pyramid, it's an 8-sided pyramid? There is an indentation in each of the faces. It's only the Great Pyramid this applies to, none of the other ones. Now, I was aware that this indentation, if you like, in the Great Pyramid existed. And I was fortunate to visit Egypt in, 15 years ago. And I was aware that this phenomena happened. And I thought, well, if I can catch the sun setting, because the pyramid's faces due east, west, north and south. Precisely. If I can get the sun setting across the face of the pyramid, I should be able to see the indentation. And I could. You can see it if you know what you're looking for. As you look at the Great Pyramid, the sun is on the right, and the left-hand side of the Great Pyramid only is illuminated. Not the right-hand side, so it's divided into two. How do they know how to do it?
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
I mean, you know, that's not a tomb. You know, these outdated Egyptologists, sorry if there are any listening, but you got it wrong. It's not a tomb. It's a far more sophisticated piece of structure than that. It's almost certainly an energy generation device.
Yeah, I'll send all the complaints to you, Marcus.
Send all the complaints to me, and I can make a very strong case for it. If you don't like what I'm saying, by the way, don't shout at don't shout at the set. Send me an email.
Yeah,
Tell
sure.
me why.
I'll put your email on the link.
Yeah.
We'll get your email at the end of the show anyway. You can put anyone wants to write to you. And also the other thing I find fascinating is that not only do the pyramids seem to line up with lots of things in this country and other countries, don't they, as well? They line up pretty much exactly.
Yes.
With things like Stonehenge and many other things.
Well, Machu Picchu lines up with Easter Island. What's that place in Cambodia? Angkor Wat.
Yeah.
There are some extraordinary things. There's a very good film. I think it's on YouTube. It's called Revelation of the Pyramid. And that gives you all the information about the things that the pyramids line up with and why they line up with and how they line up with it. Worth watching. Revelation of the Pyramid. It's just something I've watched. It's nothing that I'm promoting other than it's very good information.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Well, interestingly, I've got Gary Osborne coming on the show in the end of August, and he's been doing a lot of studies into the pyramids and linking them to the Rendlesham Forest incident. So
could well be. I haven't heard that before, so I'd be interested to hear that one.
Yeah, it's well, if you've got Jim Penniston and Gary Osborne's book,
Yeah.
The Rendlesham Enigma, it goes into a lot of that. But there's a volume 2 coming out, which is going to go more into the Rendlesham Code. So, and Gary's going to be coming on and talking about the pyramids alignment and a lot of mathematics involved, which is not my subject at all. It's probably my worst subject ever. But
It's certainly worth listening to.
yeah,
Hello.
yeah. But it's obviously going to be going into a lot of the pyramids and its measurements and things, and me mentioning what you've just mentioned there, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary structure, the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
In fact, we couldn't build it today.
That's right. I mean, this is why I was going, when we were talking about the secret space program, I was sort of going backwards to come forwards, if you see what I mean. Because I was actually going to go from the secret space program, I was going to ask you about the ancient astronauts, what your beliefs were in that, and we sort of touched on it a little bit. I think you've got to say something way back in our past has been here and did something on this planet. You know, and I think the evidence is there. We were talking about Eric von Daniken for the show.
Yeah.
You know, he's the one that kind of opened my eyes to it with the Chariots of the Gods book.
Yeah.
But of course there's several other books further on from that. But
well, in fact, before Eric von Daniken published his seminal book Chariots of the Gods, which I think was late 1960, 66, 76, I first read it in 1968, so you can tell how old I am.
Yeah, and me.
Prior to that book, the one that probably caused the most interest was a book called The Morning of the Magicians. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the authors, but Morning of the Magicians covered very similar ground, but in considerable more detail, and looking at it from almost a folklore point of view. It opened a lot of people's eyes, and that was published, I think, in 1962.
Yeah.
There were people around who were talking about it, talking about this sort of area, because it makes no sense to say that we are a group of monkeys that climbed down out of the tree and got intelligent, or fish that climbed out of the sea and got intelligent, and we've gone from living in trees to stripy toothpaste and nuclear weapons.
Yeah, definitely.
It makes no sense.
No, of course it doesn't.
Because if man had lived on this planet for millions of years before he climbed out of the trees or climbed out of the sea or wherever he came from, how has it taken literally a few hundred years, maybe a couple of thousand years, to develop to where we are today, where we can allegedly go to the moon? I say allegedly, advisedly. Allegedly go to the moon, but we can bomb each other into the next universe.
Indeed. Yeah.
We can develop things like iPads and iPhones and stripy toothpaste and all the other attributes of modern life. And we've done it in literally a few hundred years. I mean, your great-grandparent, well, my great-grandparents, the fastest they ever travelled was on a galloping horse.
Yeah.
That was only 150 years ago.
That would have been mine as well, yeah.
Yeah. So we've come a long way in a very short period of time. It's almost as if we've been helped. And I think we have been. And once we start to find out where the help has come from, it's like it's going back, because every country, it's not every country, every culture has a mythology of a golden age, a period of time earlier than the present, obviously much earlier than the present, where things were so much better. It's almost a mythological memory. But mythology is often based on reality. And because we don't remember it precisely, we embellish it and we make it so that we can understand it in our present circumstances. Prior to Eric von Daniken, prior to Morning of the Magicians, there was Immanuel Velikovsky.
Yes, Worlds in Collision and Ages in Chaos. I remember reading those.
Yes, I think there are about 6-7 books he published altogether.
Yeah, they're the two I can remember offhand. I know I read those two, but I think...
Oh, they're very, very good books. In fact, he was one of the very first people who got seriously attacked for what he'd written.
I know.
And in fact, his book got so much publicity it became a worldwide bestseller. It's a very good book, Worlds in Collision. It's literally talking about taking the ancient biblical events and relating them to real events that have occurred.
Yeah.
And one of them was the birth of Venus. Not the famous painting, The Birth of Venus, but literally the birth of the planet. Where did it come from? It came out of Jupiter. And just to look at that again, there are a lot of stories going back into mythology, which is just history not fully understood, talking about thunderbolts, talking about people watching in the sky, things that are going on, thunderbolts in the sky. Now, if you are somebody living, say, a fairly hunter-gatherer type existence a few thousand years ago, and you're suddenly aware in the sky, because you're very much aware of what's going on in the sky, there's no light pollution, campfire pollute much, so you're very much aware of things going on in the sky. If you're suddenly aware of a large object getting bigger and bigger as the days go by, which means it's approaching you, and you see this thing, and it's coming through the solar system towards Earth, and you see, and you don't know what's going to happen, and it goes very, very close to Earth, and by doing that, if it's an object the size of Earth or bigger than Earth, what it will do as it approaches Earth, it will attract all the oceans towards it. As the gravity, as it goes past Earth, the oceans will be swept across the face of the Earth, and as the object in the sky diminishes and goes away, the oceans will revert back to their position. Could that have been the cause of the great flood that is in every culture in the world? Yeah. And that was only, 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So there are many things in our history.
And the possible destruction of Atlantis, let's not forget.
Exactly. Now, have you heard of the Richat structure?
I've heard the term, but I couldn't tell you what it was.
All right. The Richat structure, it's a physical structure. It's not actually a structure. It's in Mauritania. It's about 20 miles in diameter. It's 3 concentric circles. It's so big you can see it from space. And it became famous because when astronauts were being launched from Florida out towards Africa, because that's how they were sent, they would watch out for what they called the Eye of Africa, right, which is the Richat structure. It's in western Mauritania. Nobody knows what it is. Very few people have even visited it. It's very remote. But ironically, you can see it from space, so people are familiar with it. If you go onto Google Earth and put in Richat structure, you'll see it. It's in Mauritania. It won't tell you very much, but it's fascinating to see it. And that fits the description of Atlantis. 3 concentric circles, 20 miles in diameter.
Wow.
I don't know if it was Atlantis, but one can make a strong case for saying that it was. And it was destroyed by a flood. And you can see the marks on the desert around it, which appear to imply that the water came from the Mediterranean, which is to the north of it, and swept across the Sahara at that point. Now, at that point, the Sahara wasn't, as we see it today, a desert. This was a place of considerable vegetation where you had sharks swimming in the sea and elephants and camels, and there was a lot of vegetation around. Something happened to change the climate around the Sahara. Could it have been this particular passage of a nearby planet that passed close enough to Earth to physically change the structure on the face of the Earth? It could have been. Yeah. There's so much evidence around. So much evidence. I mean, you've just got to read it. And if people say, well, it's just ridiculous, all this sort of thing. I said, look at the evidence.
Oh, yeah. It's mind-boggling, actually, a lot of it. There's so much. You've only got to watch a show like Ancient Aliens on the amount of things that are on there that, alright, you might not agree with everything to ancient alien orientated, but some of the structures, how did we actually build them? The fitting together of the rocks and things, it's just impossible. We couldn't do it today.
Exactly. Which is why I said earlier, we can't build the Great Pyramid today. But, well, why would we even bother?
That's right.
To actually physically do it, basically you've got to lift a 70-ton block of granite 200 foot up into the air and move it how far is it?
Of course, the higher it's going, the heavier it's getting, isn't it?
It's 200 foot horizontally. We haven't got cranes that can do that today.
Yeah.
You've got cranes that can lift a 70-ton block. That's not a problem. But to move it 200 foot horizontally is another story altogether.
And they tell stories about they rolled it on logs, but there weren't any logs around in the desert.
Rolling bloody logs. That's such a stupid answer. You know.
Oh, they only had palm trees.
Yeah, exactly. Palm trees get crushed quite easily.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, the idea that this was all built by slaves rolling logs, oh, forget it. You know, that's not the way it works.
And also they brought these great big heavy rocks on boats as well, didn't they? I mean, the boat would just sink, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. I mean, those 70-ton blocks, and there are, I think, 60 of them in the Great Pyramids, they were brought from Aswan, which is 500 miles south of Giza.
Yeah.
How do they do that? Oh, just put them on boats and...
They just go through the boat, a wooden boat.
Fair-sized boat. And anyway, but here's a question about moving large block. What is the largest block ever moved by man?
Oh,
or known to have been moved by man?
Actual evidence of it? I really wouldn't know, Marcus, to be honest.
Okay, it's in St. Petersburg in Russia. It is the base, it is the plinth on which the very famous statue called the Bronze Horseman stands. The Bronze Horseman is Peter the Great, not St. Peter, Peter the Great, who was the Tsar of Russia. It was erected by his wife Catherine the Great. And in order to make it impressive, it's a pretty big sculpture. It's basically a horse, the Bronze Horseman. And there was a thunderstorm and a strike of lightning dislodged a large lump of granite from a mountain in Finland, which is quite close to Russia. And they decided they would move this huge block of granite from Finland to provide it to make the base for the sculpture, for the statue of the Bronze Horseman. And the only way they could do it was to wait until it froze, the ground froze. They would then use cannonballs in gutter-like channels to move it across the frozen ground, put it into a boat, brought it across the Gulf of Finland, took it out of the boat, and rolled it across into the position they wanted it. Well, this was 1760. This was done, so it was quite early days. But the plinth on which the Bronze Horseman stood is 1,500 tons.
Right. Yeah.
Now that is supposed to be the largest known item moved by man. There are plenty of other much larger stones, specifically the one that's referred to as the pregnant woman at Baalbek, which is about 1,500 tons, which sits on top of another block, even bigger.
What?
Then the blocks in the western wall of the Temple of Jerusalem are about 300 tons. So there are some big things which have been moved, but nobody seems to know how they did it. But the Romans were also able to do a lot of this moving, because they moved several obelisks from Egypt. There's one in St. Peter's Square in Rome, which is an obelisk that came from Egypt. There's one on the embankment in London. It's called Cleopatra's Needle.
Yep.
That's an obelisk from Karnak.
Yeah, that's fairly small, isn't it, compared to some of the others?
It is. It's quite small. So it was relatively easy to move. So moving large blocks of stone appears to be no trouble to the ancients. But we have a lot of trouble doing it today.
Yeah, seems to be. Now, the reason I was talking about ancient aliens, we seem to be talking about ancient aliens, the moon could be artificial. Now, could it be mechanical inside? The question is, who put it there? Then we go on to aliens on the moon. Now, you seem to believe there are aliens. Now, then we go back to, could something have crashed at Roswell? I'm going back this far because I'm talking about perhaps engineering, you know, like future engineering sort of thing from Roswell.
Yes.
Which could have actually helped in the space race. That's kind of where I'm going with this.
Okay, yes. See where you're going. I understand that. Certainly something crashed at Roswell, but nobody could give you a definitive answer as to what it was.
Yeah.
Because it all went black. One of the things that was being developed as a result of that, or possibly in connection with it, is a lot of the anti-gravity propulsion that was known about in the early 1950s. This is a few years after Roswell. And it was known that a lot of people were doing reverse engineering on what was discovered. And some of the reverse engineering was trying to work out how on earth the thing flew. How did it move? But obviously it had come from quite a long way away. It wasn't just sort of down the road. Roswell's in New Mexico, so it didn't just come from California. It came from a great deal further away than that. So they're trying to work out how the propulsion system worked. And it appeared to be based on the principle of anti-gravity, or using gravity as a form of propulsion. Now in the mid-1950s, all this research suddenly disappeared. Obviously at that time it was published in magazines, it was published in books, and there was no such thing as the internet then. No. But it all stopped being published, and people were suddenly aware that there was no more discussion about it, because a lot of people were interested in it, obviously. It's as if the whole idea of ancient alien, or ET coming from another place, whether it's the moon or another galaxy or another, was something that was not going to be discussed. It was going to be ridiculed. And that was the purpose of Operation Blue Book, to ridicule the whole idea of any UFOs. I mean, UFOs are seen around the world every day. Yeah. There are hundreds of sightings. Yep. There's an interesting collection. I receive a weekly list of sightings. All right, they're not particularly exciting. You know, they're lights in the sky, but they're not aircraft. They're not planets misidentified. They are something else. Even if only half of them, even if only 10% of them are unexplained when you start examining it, that still means hundreds of sightings of unexplained objects flying around this planet, not being challenged by anybody because nobody knows how to do it. Where are they coming from? What are they doing? Are they just observing us? Are we like animals in a zoo? Are we like rats in a maze? Are humans such unique creatures that they have to be studied from a distance? And there are certainly a lot of stories which indicate that humans are unique in the universe, that we exhibit emotion. This is something which, there are many stories which imply this. The ET has no concept of what emotion is. They take, it's that famous portrayal of Dr. Spock in Star Trek. Dr. Spock was logical.
I think you mean Mr. Spock. Dr. Spock was another one, wasn't it, for the childhood?
Oh, that's right. Mr. Spock. Yeah, sorry about. Well done, David. You showed me my arrow today. Mr. Spock, who was famously logical. Everything had to be explained. He didn't do emotion. That was Captain Kirk who did emotion, and Bones, he did emotion. So the idea that ET is fascinated by the human race because of its ability to exhibit emotion, whether it's good emotion or bad emotion, you know, fear and anger, terror, or whether it's love or understanding or friendliness. There are so many different emotions that humans can exhibit. It's almost as if people feed off it.
Yeah.
If they can make us angry enough to fight wars with each other, which we do very successfully, we've been doing it for years, hundreds of years, thousands of years we've been fighting each other. Yeah. It's a generation of negative emotion. We're gradually becoming intelligent enough to realize that that's not a good idea, and we should stop doing it.
Yeah,
now, whether
not all of us, unfortunately, but I see where you're going with that. We do actually hear a lot of that with about the greys and the reptilians, don't we? That they seem to feed off of our emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is something which needs further study. I think it is something that we're only becoming aware of. So we've sort of deteriorated as a race. It's almost as if we were created whenever whenever humans were created, whether we came out of the ocean or whether we came out of the trees, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the generally accepted view is that man originated in Africa. I don't happen to believe that's correct. I believe he originated in Australia.
Oh, right. Okay.
There's far more evidence that humans, as we understand it today, originated in Australia. Now, you say, well, how do you get to Africa from Australia? Very easy. A few thousand years ago, you could almost walk there.
Yeah, all the lands were joined, yeah.
Yeah, sea level was a great deal lower then. And by the same token, there's the story of the famous hieroglyphs just north of Sydney, Gosford. I think it's called a small village called Gosford, north of Sydney. And there are some very famous Egyptian hieroglyphs carved into the rock. And they basically tell a rather sad story of a group of presumably Egyptians who got shipwrecked because they didn't know the Great Barrier Reef was there. And anyway, they got ashore, and they left this message saying, we got shipwrecked, we can't get home. So how did they get from Egypt to Australia? Well, very easy. If you look at any map, if you look at Google Earth, you can see there is a canal between the Nile, north of, just by Cairo. It goes across to the Great Bitter Lakes, which is now part of the Suez Canal, but then it was linked to the Red Sea. It was perfectly easy to sail ships, quite big ships, from Giza across to the Red Sea. If you go down the Red Sea, you follow the coastline all around Arabia, around India, down Malaysia, down to Singapore, and from there, well, it's called Singapore now, it wasn't then. You can then get across to New Guinea, and the longest stretch of water you'll have to cross is about 50 miles. You get to Australia. And that is how they did it, because in the Cairo Museum there are exhibits of boomerangs. They're called throwing sticks, but they are, in effect, boomerangs. Boomerangs originated in Australia about 40, 50,000 years ago. So there was obviously communications between Australia and ancient Egypt, as we call it, probably prior to the time of Ramesses the Great, about 1250 BC.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, many things going on. So you've got all this information. People are now starting to gather it together and to look at it in context. What do all these ancient structures mean? How did they build them? Who were the people who were around at the time? Was there a city called El Dorado in the middle of the Amazon basin? Yes, there was. There is something called, I forget the name of it, it's the soil. There's a special type of soil in the Amazon basin, because the Amazon basin technically is a bit of a barren area. It's not very good soil, except for certain parts of it, which are so fertile that basically anything will grow on. Once you can find it, and it does exist, it's now being commercially grown, as it were, because it's basically what it is. There's fungus, there's fungi, and there's all sorts of particles in it, which nobody can understand how they got there, let alone how they develop. But this soil appears to be able to support really quite large communities, and had supported them. So what was going on in the Amazon basin, I think, is important as well. It's only just being discovered now. And Graham Hancock's book, America Before, does recount some of this.
Fascinating.
So,
wow. Well, I guess we better jump towards the actual NASA and everything now. Now, I was going to actually talk about the Germans because the Americans took off a lot of Nazi war criminals and brought them over to America to work for NASA. There was about 1,500 of them. And,
yes, there were.
And leading those was von Braun, who worked on the B-2 rockets and everything.
Yes, he did.
Now,
he lost.
Now, this is where I begin to think, look, because we've got all this brain power being brought over to work for NASA, when they weren't working to cover everything up, were they? They were actually working on a project to actually get us to the moon. Well, so we're led to believe.
Yes, that because these they're called the paperclip scientists.
Yeah.
Because they had paperclipped to their visa applications a form which said these men were not avid Nazis, so they were allowed into the United States. That was late 1940s. They didn't actually do very much until the late 1950s, so they're there for about 10 years. Fort Worth is where most of them stayed, in Texas. And then, once the Cold War started to get a bit hot and Russia was showing that they could build rockets as well as anybody, because they'd got a few of these Nazi scientists as well. So they were building the rockets, and they were trying to launch ICBM. Remember ICBMs?
Yeah,
Intercontinental missile?
Yeah.
Yeah, with nuclear bombs on the top. So everybody was scared rigid.
Yeah.
The idea that a nuclear bomb can be put on top of a rocket and fired off and explode anywhere is complete fiction. The idea that a nuclear bomb goes off just anywhere is complete fiction. It doesn't. It has to be very, very carefully located. The position on the Earth's surface has to be very, very carefully selected for a particular time. When the only two nuclear weapons that have ever gone off in anger were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the pilot of the Enola Gay, the plane, the B-29 bomber that dropped the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, the very first message he transmitted after the bomb had exploded, because he could see it, obviously he was close enough, he said, "We got it to within 1 second." That was the first message he transmitted. Why was it so important to get something to within 1 second when a nuclear bomb will destroy everything within miles? Makes no sense until you realize that a nuclear bomb does not just go off anywhere. It has to be carefully located on the Earth's surface at a specific angle to the sun and a reciprocal of the speed of light. Now that may all sound very complicated, but that is how it is calculated where a nuclear bomb will go off. Every other nuclear explosion has been a test, i.e. it's been predicted in advance because everybody knew where it was going to go off. So how do we know this? How do we know that you have to carefully select the physical location on the planet and the time it will go off? In the late 1990s, there was the French were doing their nuclear tests in the Pacific. And this was when Greenpeace were getting rather overactive about trying to stop them, because that was the original purpose of Greenpeace, stopping nuclear tests. And there was a gentleman in New Zealand who published a letter in his local paper announcing the times of the French nuclear tests a few weeks in advance. He got a visit from the police. How do you know this? They thought he was a spy. The French were very paranoid about keeping everything secret. And he said, "I calculated it. It's very simple. This is how you do it." And he showed them. He said, there are only certain places they're going to explode the bombs. The Mururoa Atoll, I think it was. And if you're going to do it there, these are the dates and times that you'll explode it. And this is how you calculate it. And he showed them. They said, "Would you keep that to yourself, please?" He said, "No, I'm going to," and he published it in his book. That's Bruce Cathay. So we know that nuclear bombs don't go off just anywhere. They have to be carefully planned in advance. So sticking them on top of a rocket, which will not land very precisely, is a completely ridiculous concept of exploding a nuclear bomb. It's never going to happen. The whole Cold War was a fiction.
Right. I never knew that. It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And any decent nuclear scientist will tell you that as well. And if he can't tell you that, he's not a decent nuclear scientist.
Yeah.
So, forget the Cold War, but it was being ramped up, and if you publish something and shout it loud enough in enough newspapers and television programs and radio shows, people will come to believe it. Wear masks, we're told. So we all believe it, and we wear masks.
Yeah.
It's not difficult to get 95% of the population to do what you want them to do. It's called positive emphasis of the important matters required of government to function. Anyway, so if nuclear bombs won't go off just anywhere, which we now know they won't, the Cold War was a complete fiction, but at the time it was happening, in the late 50s, early 60s, people genuinely believed it, because they'd seen the damage that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs could do. They'd heard about the downwinders, the sort of the people who were deliberately exposed to nuclear fallout from Nevada, because the American government wanted to find out what happened if humans were exposed to nuclear fallout. That's the sort of thing, that's how much honour they had. They'd exposed their own citizens to nuclear fallout. Well, it killed them. Oh, surprise, surprise. So, you've got all these Russian scientists, all these Russians using German technology to build their rockets. You've got American rockets being built with German technology. And so, in May 1961, following the orbit by Yuri Gagarin, following that, 6 weeks after that orbit was April the 12th, 1961. On May the 25th, 1961, President John Kennedy, who had only been elected 4 months earlier, got up in the House of Congress and made his famous speech, "We'll land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth." He didn't know he could do it. No American had been into space at that point, except Alan Shepard, who'd been up 100 miles and come back down again.
Yeah.
But it was a deliberate political challenge to the Soviet Union, as it was known then, that America were not going to stand around. We're going to show the world what America's made of. We're going to go to the moon. All right, so you got 9 years to do it. May 1961, we had to get there by December 1969.
Now, of course, he was putting the onus on the next president also, because at the most he would have served 8 years, had he survived.
That's right, yes. If he'd survived, Kennedy was killed in November 1963, so America had to fulfill his, by then dead president's challenge to go to the moon, and they had dear old Lyndon Baines Johnson as president at this point. And when he had to step down in 1968, Richard Nixon took over. Now, Nixon had challenged Kennedy for the presidency in 1960. So there wasn't much love lost between Kennedy and, or between Nixon and Kennedy. So Nixon now had to take credit for what Kennedy had set out. So back in 1961, could they actually get a rocket up into orbit, let alone to the moon? I mean, the moon's, you could see it. It's not that far away. Well, compared to Mars. 240-odd thousand miles away to the moon. So they set to work to build this super-duper wonderful rocket called the Saturn V. It's called the Saturn V because it had 5 engines. Each one producing so much thrust, 1.5 million pounds of thrust, that it could launch itself and this tiny little spacecraft at the top all the way to the moon. Wonderful. We believed it. Dear, oh dear.
Yeah, I still do, I'm afraid, but I'm hoping you're...
Well, I do understand why people believe it, because they have no reason not to.
Well, I think apparently it's 1 in 20 people don't believe we went to the moon. As I understand that figure.
It's 1 in 4 now. It's gone up.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, 25% challenge it. Now, why do they challenge it? Why do people not go along with it? Because, you know, it's a seminal event in human history. It's the greatest television moment of the 20th century, we're told.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, everyone can remember where they were when they landed on the moon, because we're all gathered around our little black and white television sets watching these strange little pictures live from the moon.
I mean, I think...
What's this live from the moon business? Who on earth? How on earth did you do that?
Well, I remember, we could skip over like Apollo 1, which unfortunately blew up and killed 3 astronauts, at the time, which they think was because of a faulty wire. I think there was some chemical dropping onto it or something. And then we had the rest of those were basically practice Apollo missions until we get to Apollo 8, which actually was supposed to have gone round the dark side, as we call it, the dark side of the moon. Now I remember being glued to the TV, you know, back in that was 1967, 68, was it? No, must be about 67, wasn't it? I think
it was. Apollo 8 was December 1968.
December 68, right?
Yeah. Now let's just go back a wee bit earlier than that. Let's go. Because the first official launch of the full-up Saturn V rocket was Apollo 6, and that took off early in 1968, late 1967. It was unmanned, but it was full-up. It was the full 3-stage Apollo craft, and it very nearly destroyed itself by what's called the POGO effect. It was basically acoustic resonance. There's so much power in those engines. I said 1.5 million, that's 600 tons of thrust in each of those 5 engines. It had to have that to get the damn thing off the ground. It was so heavy. The point is that the engines were unstable. They eventually, and NASA actually says this, we found a solution, but we didn't know what the problem was.
Yeah.
So, though they knew there was a problem with the engine, with this instability, they solved it by the simple expedient, because what they thought it was to do with the flow of fuel into the rocket motor itself. And we're talking flow in hundreds of gallons per second. There's a huge amount of movement. And if it is igniting unevenly, you will get this acoustic resonance. It's basically the shock waves. That was Apollo 6. The next launch of the full-up Saturn V rocket was on Apollo 8, the one we mentioned. Apollo 7 occurred, that was just low, that was at Earth orbit, so it really doesn't count.
Yeah, they basically do what they said they were going to be doing round the moon, but round Earth instead, don't they?
Yes. Then Apollo 8, they put 3 astronauts on top. This is in an untested rocket. It had never flown to the moon. Before they put 3 astronauts on top of it, fired it off, allegedly got to the moon, orbited the moon, they read from the book of Genesis, caused a lot of trouble, come back to Earth, land back on Earth, oh whoopee, and successful. Because the other thing they had to test, aside from the rocket itself, was the heat shield to protect the astronauts in the command module. This is the little triangular shaped bit in which they all lived, and which is the only part of the rocket that comes back to Earth.
The capsule,
and back on 3 parachutes. Now the problem with the heat shield is that spacecraft don't have brakes. You're coming back at the same speed you leave Earth at. Escape velocity from Earth is 25,000 miles an hour. That's quite fast. As you come back to Earth, you're being attracted by the Earth's gravity all the time you're coming back. So you're accelerating towards Earth. You've got to slow down, otherwise you're going to crash into the Earth and you'll be history. So the only way you can slow down is you have to come in at a very, very precise angle, 6.5 degrees to the Earth's surface. Not 7 degrees, not 6 degrees, 6.5 degrees. And then the frictional force of the atmosphere as you come in will basically slow you down. You know, it's like sticking your hand out of the window of a car doing 60 miles an hour. You'll feel the force of the wind. or feel the force of the air. You're coming at 25,000 miles an hour, you stick your hand out the window, it'll be blown off. You've got to slow down. So you use a heat shield to protect you. And this heat shield is made of a resin material which will basically destroy itself, and it will protect the craft which is behind it. But that heat shield had never been tested before Apollo 8. So we've got an untested rocket, an untested heat shield, astronauts going 240,000 miles from Earth for the very first time, in a spacecraft which didn't have very much pressure. Now, there are three problems in space that you have to overcome. One is temperature, one is radiation, and the third is the vacuum. Space is a vacuum. There's nothing there. The atmosphere above us now weighs 14.7 pounds per square inch. If you took a column of air above you, that's what it would weigh. But it doesn't affect us because we have as much pressure inside our body, pushing out, as we do have pressure pushing in. So it balances, and if you're a deep sea diver, you go underwater, you've got to be careful when you surface, because you don't want to surface too fast, or all the gases in your bloodstream and in your body will expand too fast, because they've been compressed by the pressure. They'll expand too fast, and you'll get what's called the bends, which is very uncomfortable, and it will not be something you want to experience. But the reverse happens in space. You go into space, there's a vacuum. If you're in a vacuum, you've still got the pressure inside your body, but you haven't got very much pressure outside. So you take your pressure with you in your spacecraft or in your spacesuit. Because man cannot survive in a vacuum. It's not possible. You've heard of the expression altitude sickness, where people climb a mountain and they get a bit ill. It affects people in different ways, but it affects quite a lot of people. That is the result of the lack of pressure. Because the higher you go, let's say you're climbing Everest. If you're going to climb Everest, you've got to train a little bit for it. Because at the top of Everest, the air pressure is literally 5 pounds per square inch. It's very much less than it is at sea level. So you've got to acclimatise yourself to it. So you climb up to 14,000, 15,000 feet, and you've got to stay around there for a little while to get used to that. Then you got to base camp, which is 19,000 feet. You've got to stay around there for a little while. And at that height, people start to suffer from altitude sickness. And that is the result of the lack of pressure. Because the human body is designed to absorb oxygen through our lungs. If there isn't enough external pressure forcing the oxygen into our lungs, it will not get absorbed into the bloodstream, and we'll start getting hallucinations and passing out and generally not behaving very, very well. That is a result of a lack of pressure in a vacuum. So you've got this climbing Mount Everest. If you're going to climb Mount Everest, you've probably got to take additional oxygen with you. There are very, very few people who have ever climbed Mount Everest without using oxygen. Because above that, you get even less pressure. Now, the point about this whole business of climbing Mount Everest with lack of pressure is that the astronauts in all Apollo craft were kept at a pressure inside their craft of 4.8 pounds per square inch, which is not very much. Their spacesuits had a similar level of pressure, 4.8 pounds per square inch. That is not enough to survive. It's the same as it is at the top of Mount Everest. And you know the problems people have there with altitude sickness. But no astronaut ever reported suffering from altitude sickness, or the equivalent. It's as if they weren't there in the first place. If they didn't train for it, there was no training of any astronaut for going into this type of environment, this lack of pressure. this vacuum level. No training at all. It's all detailed very, very closely in the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, what they were doing. And they were talking to the press, they were larking about and behaving in like sort of good old American boys. They weren't training to operate in a low pressure environment. They were not doing it, and they're still not doing it today. There's only ever been one piece of film that I've ever seen of an astronaut being put into a vacuum environment on Earth. It's quite easy to create a vacuum environment. You just pump the air out. And he said, after a few minutes, he literally passed out. And then they never conducted the test again. He said the last sensation he remembers feeling was the moisture on his tongue boiling. That is what happens when you reduce pressure. And you can prove it in a little school experiment. You put a cup of water inside a vacuum chamber or bell shape, pump all the air out, and you get the water will start boiling. That's called outgassing. So it's easy to do. They don't even train today. They train them in bloody swimming pools, for God's sake. What do you want in a swimming pool when you're going into a vacuum, which is lack of pressure?
Yeah, I've seen them doing that actually when I went to Houston on the tour. They've got a massive, great big swimming pool there.
Yeah, they have. Huge, great swimming pool with a replica of the International Space Station in it.
That's right, yeah.
Why are they training in a pressurized environment when they're going to be working in a vacuum? Did you ask them that?
It never crossed my mind.
It's the question I would immediately ask them, because it's falsification. It's completely the reverse of what you'd expect them to do. NASA don't know what the hell they're doing, and they don't dare do it, because the only vacuum chamber they've got big enough to train in is in Ohio. It's at the Glenn Research Center. It's the one, if you remember, Brian Cox decided to do his experiment of dropping a baseball and a feather at the same time, and he demonstrated that in a vacuum they both fall to the ground at the same time. Well, of course they bloody do. There's no air pressure. There's no resistance. You know, it took 3 days to pump the chamber out, so it must have cost a fortune. So there is no training done today. There was no training done back in the 60s, training in a vacuum. Because vacuum has really quite serious effects, not just on humans, but on material. Right, if you put photographic film into a vacuum, right, let's just categorize vacuums. On Earth, I said there is at sea level, 14.7 pound per square inch. It's very difficult to imagine what such a small amount of pressure would be up on the moon. So a scale of measurement of vacuum was developed by an Italian scientist, the guy who developed the barometer, the atmospheric barometer. It's called Torricelli, Evangelista Torricelli. Lived in the 17th century. And the measurement of vacuum is named after him. It's called TOR, T-O-O, T-O-R-R. Now, at sea level, TOR level is 760. And anybody who's familiar with barometers will know that is also the barometric measurement of air pressure at sea level, 760. So 760 TOR. When you get to the International Space Station, you're measuring TOR at 10 to the minus 6. So it's a millionth of the level at sea level. When you get to the moon, it's 10 to the minus 12. TOR 10 to the minus 12. That is 10 with 12 noughts after it. So it's tiny, literally. It's a logarithmic scale. So what we're talking about here is extreme vacuum. It's technically called a very hard vacuum on the moon. At the International Space Station, yeah, it's not exactly a soft vacuum, but it's not particularly impressive. So in space, one thinks of space as having nothing in it, and technically that's correct. There is nothing in space. That's why there is a vacuum. But a vacuum has remarkable properties. It forces things out of existing material. Hence the term outgassing. It literally, volatile elements in metals, in liquids, are forced out because there's nothing to hold them in.
Yeah, I suppose.
And that's why.
Is that right? We'd actually, if we weren't in a spacesuit, we'd actually pop, wouldn't we? I believe.
If we, yes,
your skull would basically explode.
Yes, it would take about 20 seconds. And then, basically, the gases inside your body would expand to such an extent that it couldn't be contained. And yeah, as you say, your head would explode. Not a very pleasant way to go. But on the moon, the vacuum is even harder than it is at the International Space Station. Well, the point I'm making about this is that the photographs that we've seen taken on the lunar surface were taken with Hasselblad film cameras. I've handled a replica version of it, so I know what they are. I've also handled one in a professional capacity when I was a photographer in London. Hasselblad are very good cameras. They were chosen to go onto the Apollo mission so that they could be recorded. And if you look at the records as published by NASA on their website, they put every photograph taken on the lunar surface on their website. You can go and look at them. There's 5,771 taken over the 6 missions allegedly landed on the moon. I mentioned that film outgasses in a vacuum, and we've actually done an experiment to test this, and it does happen. So, unless you're operating under a degree of pressure, you can stop it happening if the film is maintained under a degree of pressure about 1 pound per square inch, which is not very much, but it's enough to stop a film outgassing. The film cameras used on the lunar surface, the film camera and the stills cameras, the Hasselblad cameras, the film cameras were called Maurer, 16mm film cameras, were not pressurized. They were not pressurized. So the film would outgas. And in the experiments we did, which it's very hard to get much more than about 2 or 10 to the minus 3 on a commercial vacuum chamber here on Earth. But even at that relatively low level of vacuum, the colour balance of the film was shot to pieces, the film became brittle, and it would start to break up, and it wouldn't be able to go through the rather convoluted pathway it was designed to do on the Hasselblad camera. So the photographs taken on the lunar surface were not taken on the lunar surface, they were taken here on Earth. It couldn't have been taken on the lunar surface because the film would have been destroyed. End of story. End of moon landings. Didn't happen. Couldn't happen. Complete fabrication. The whole thing was a brilliantly executed propaganda exercise designed to demonstrate to the world, and specifically the Soviet Union, the technological superiority of the United States. And it was entirely successful. But it didn't land on the moon. The Russians know it. The Chinese know it. The Indians know it. Everybody except America seems to know that they didn't land on the moon.
Well, then, see, that's something that kind of puzzles me. Wouldn't the Russians or the Chinese, especially now, they seem to be the biggest enemy, they'd take great pleasure in exposing these lies, wouldn't they?
No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. What's the advantage to them in exposing it?
Well,
why would they do it? All right. Let's go back to the time it happened, the late 1960s. I said the Russians were totally aware of the fact that no American had landed on the moon. Why didn't they expose it? What was the advantage to the Soviet Union in doing that? It would have pissed America off something rotten. And in September 1968, i.e. before Apollo 8, in September 1968, Russia had gone through the Second War at this point, obviously, and it had suffered severe losses. It was trying to recover. Europe recovered through the Marshall Program. The Soviet Union didn't have any assistance, but it had one major export commodity, natural gas. It has huge quantities of it in Siberia. Russia wanted to export its natural gas to earn foreign currency to trade with the rest of the world. It didn't even have a heavy industry at the time capable of manufacturing the 2,000 kilometers of pipeline required to deliver the natural gas from the Siberian gas fields into Western Europe. In September 1968, an agreement was signed between Soviet Union, West Germany, Hungary and Italy. West Germany would supply the pipes, Russia would supply the gas. It's called Pipes for Gas. It's perfectly, you could check it out.
Yeah, no, I do remember all that, yeah.
Yeah. So Russia were determined to export their natural gas. They weren't going to blow the whistle on some idiot Americans prancing around allegedly on the lunar surface. How would it benefit them? It wouldn't. They wouldn't have any benefit in that at all. Why go to the trouble? Why poke the bear? Why upset America when you don't have to? They didn't have to. They could just say, okay, well, you say you're on the moon, good luck to you. Now do it again and see if you can get back. Oh, we've done it again. Oh, that's good, well done. We're not going to go there. The Russians were actually asked by Bernard Lovell, who ran the Jodrell Bank radio telescope south of Manchester. He was helping track the Russian craft because Russia didn't have at the time, in the mid-1960s, they didn't have the deep space tracking network that America had. They were based in Spain, in California and in Australia. There's a film made about the Australian one. It's called The Dish. They were big receivers that could maintain a tracking facility at all times, no matter what the position of the Earth was in relation to the moon. They could track any craft allegedly going to the moon. They weren't going to the moon. It was a wonderful piece of misdirection, the whole thing. But Russia couldn't do it. So they were using Jodrell Bank as one of their tracking stations, and the head of it, Bernard Lovell, visited Russia on several occasions, and on one of those occasions he asked the head of the Soviet space program, he said, when are you going to send men to the moon? Because they're actually building a rocket to do it. And he said, well, we'll be sending cosmonauts to the moon as soon as we can ensure their safe return due to the dangers of radiation. So the Soviets were fully aware that there were major problems with radiation in space. You ask the Americans, we went through these Van Allen belts very fast. In fact, there's no more than a couple of chest x-rays.
Yeah, something actually struck me about that, the Van Allen belt. I was going to call it the Marcus Allen belt from now on.
Well, you can call it, that. Yeah, very sensible. Yeah, the Van Allen, they're actually named after Professor James Van Allen of Iowa University, who was the first person to identify them. He'd theoretically created, he was basically an astrophysicist. He had theorized that these radiation belts existed, but he wanted to prove it. So one of the very first American rockets launched in 1958, time of the International Geophysical Year, which was 18 months long. He put a Geiger counter on top of this rocket and sent it off, and it started clicking away. Suddenly it stopped. That's we didn't set it high enough. But it was indicating that there were radiation levels that varied with height above the Earth. So he put a more powerful Geiger counter on Explorer 4, sent it up, and sure enough, it started clicking away, and then it stopped, and it just carried on. It started clicking again. That's how he determined that there were two belts, and they were named after him. Now, this Geiger counter is starting to record quite high levels of radiation, and the first reaction back in 1958 was, bloody hell, space is radioactive. But we're continually told that these belts, it's nothing more than a couple of chest x-rays, won't matter. So what protection did the Apollo astronauts carry with them? None at all. No protection on their spacecraft, no protection in their spacesuits.
Yeah.
And they go out to this really quite dangerous environment, because space is full of radioactivity. of radiation. It comes from the sun. They're called solar particle events or solar flares. It comes from deep space, galactic cosmic rays. These are lethal to humans, but we're protected because these Van Allen belts divert the radiation around Earth based on the Earth's magnetic field. We're very fortunate. Whoever designed it did a very good job because, we can survive on Earth's surface quite comfortably. We don't need to protect ourselves against radiation unless we go out in the sun for too long. And so, basically sunlight is radiation anyway. It's the same thing. And we can protect ourselves against a bit of extra sunlight by putting a bit of clothing on, a bit of sunscreen on. When you go into space, how do you protect your spacecraft? How do you protect the astronauts from the radiation of space?
There was a show on the History Channel a little while back, just a couple of months ago actually. They were talking about the Van Allen belt with the two, because you got the alpha and beta of the Van Allen belts, and they did say that they weren't too worried about the alpha belt. It was the beta part of it they were more worried about, and in fact it wasn't the actual, the danger wasn't going through the belt. It was actually how quickly you went through it. If you went through it slowly, it'd be more dangerous, obviously. But so it was the speed you went through it and at what angle. I think that's how they explained that what the craft would manage to get to the moon, without having to sort of think about that danger. Because apparently it was 3 inches of steel and aluminium in the craft was made of.
It was made of 3 inches of aluminium.
Yeah.
There was a bit of steel in it, but it was basically honeycombed aluminium. That doesn't protect you from any radiation.
Well, I mean, that was the explanation they gave on the show.
That's.
And they gave an experiment. They made an experiment of it. They put it in a glass beaker, and they did some measurements with isotopes in the bottom of the thing. And you probably saw it yourself.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen a lot of NASA's fantasy films. What these are. No, they're trying to persuade you that radiation is not a problem in space. Oh, yes, it is. It's a big problem. It's the major problem. Vacuum is up there with it, but they keep telling you that, you go through it fast enough, you won't get affected by it. You get outside the other side of the Van Allen belts, they only go at about 25,000 miles out. You're in deep space, and it's full of radiation out there. Just because it's not called the Van Allen belts doesn't mean to say that radiation has stopped. No, there's plenty of radiation there. The moon is almost radioactive. But it's being bombarded with alpha particles, beta particles, gamma particles, X-rays, all the nasty stuff that we get protected from here on Earth. But out on the moon, you're exposed to it all. And yet we're asked to believe that they didn't even wear a spacesuit that had any radiation protection in it at all. I know that because I asked them. I asked the manufacturer of the spacesuit. I said, what radiation protection is built into the spacesuits? Because they obviously protected all the astronauts from the radiation in space. And they said, we built them according to the specification NASA provided to us. You better direct your question to them. I'm still waiting for the answer. Because there isn't an answer. They didn't have protection in their spacesuit. Why not? Because when you're prancing around on the lunar surface, you're exposed to radiation coming from all angles. And Apollo 17, they were on the lunar surface, exposed out in the lunar surface, not just in their craft, on the lunar surface, 6 hours at a time. They were on the lunar surface for 3 days on Apollo 17.
Or not, as you're saying.
Well, no, they weren't. I mean, that's the story. That's NASA's fantasy. Because if you then look at the temperature, what's the temperature of space? Well, space hasn't got a temperature. There's nothing there to have a temperature until you put something in space that will have a temperature, like a spacecraft, or the Earth, or the Moon. No, they will have temperatures. And the calculation for it is called the black body radiation temperature. It's a fairly complex formula. It uses something called the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, and you can calculate the temperature of any object in space, depending on its size and its angle towards the sun, because that's where the radiation comes from. You've got a spacecraft standing on the lunar surface. What's the internal temperature? The answer is 246 degrees Fahrenheit. How do they keep cool? Because you can't live in that. You can cook chickens at that temperature. But you put humans at that temperature, they'll cook too. So you've got to keep them cool. How do you keep astronauts cool on the lunar surface? You can't air condition it. There's nowhere to dump the heat. Air conditioning works by taking heat from inside a room and dumping it into the atmosphere outside it. There's no atmosphere on the moon, there's a vacuum. It's the best insulator of them all. There's nowhere to dump the heat. Oh, they use explosive decompression of water. How much water would you need to carry to reduce, you can reduce temperature by the explosive decompression of water, but you've got to carry an awful lot of water with you. And if you're going to try to do that in a spacesuit, you can calculate how much water you need to carry. And it's a great deal more than the 3 litres the spacesuits had available to them. It's a fantasy. The whole thing is a complete fantasy. You know, I've seen 80-foot gorillas climb the Empire State Building in King Kong. I've seen dinosaurs chasing kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. That's Hollywood at its finest. And so was Apollo. It's a fantasy.
So it all began really, that the lies, according to you, well, obviously from Apollo from the beginning, but Apollo 8 was the first one that was supposed to have gone around the moon. So what did they do? Did they just orbit the Earth?
Yeah, just orbit the Earth. Now, people will come back and say, no, of course they couldn't orbit the Earth, you'd see it. Because Apollo 8, I think it was lasted about 7 days. You get a big spacecraft orbiting the Earth, you'd spot it. Well, of course you would if you're looking for it, but if you're not looking for it orbiting the Earth, how would you know where to look? So, to everything I say, the NASA supporters will come back with what's found a logical refutation of what I say. But it doesn't stand up to very much scrutiny. Because yes, they could say, well, of course you'd see it if they were in Earth orbit. And how are they communicating with them? Because if it's in Earth orbit, you've got to have stations positioned all around the Earth. Well, they did have. They had the 3. They had in California, in Spain, and in Australia. So they could easily communicate with an orbiting spacecraft. There are several other details. There's something called the Tetra A satellite. The testing and training satellite, which was launched in 1968, to allow the staff at the Houston Mission Control to practice their simulations as if the signal was coming from a spacecraft on its way to the moon. They're quite upfront about it. Now, if you're sitting in a control center in Houston, looking at a television screen, how do you know where that signal has come from? You don't know. You've got no means of determining where the signal that produced the figures on your screen has come from. You don't need to know that.
So that was going to be another thing I was going to bring up. You've got tens of thousands of people working for NASA and the Apollo program. Why has nobody come forward and blown that whistle? Because I suppose you would say that they didn't know that they were part of the. Okay. They were being fooled as well. Yeah.
2 answers to that. They didn't know. There were 400,000 people who allegedly worked for Apollo. Well, not allegedly, they did work for it. They were building the best rockets they could, the best rovers, the best command centers, the best launch pads, the best of everything. There were 400,000 people who worked in the companies that produced products for the Apollo space program in the mid-1960s. That was when most of it was being done. Boeing were building the rocket, the Saturn V rockets. Grumman were building the landers. General Motors and Boeing were building the lunar rovers. It was a policy of NASA to try to employ as many companies and as many people across America as possible. And the figure of 400,000 would obviously include people like drivers and secretaries and cafeteria staff. Not all rocket scientists. There were obviously a lot of rocket scientists around. But don't forget, these were people using slide rules. Remember slide rules?
Yeah.
They were using slide rules. They weren't using computers. There was no such thing as computer-aided design.
Well, of course, the computers back then were nowhere near as powerful as they are now, were they? I mean, you'd have a whole room full, which, when our laptops now are much more powerful than a room full of computers back then. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of development going on. IBM produced the IBM 360, which is one of the most famous computer lines that they produced, and they were used originally at Houston. They were part of the setup in the control centers. So yeah, there were 400,000 people, maybe more, and they would obviously have families. So there were probably 2 million people who were working directly on the Apollo program in some form or other. The only time they would be aware of what happened was when they watched the whole thing live on television, same as we all did. Because people producing the rockets had no real need to know what the people producing the spacesuits were doing. They had no need to know about it. They were doing the best job. It's called compartmentalization. You know enough to do your own job. Maybe a few people near to you. But you don't need to know more than that. It's a military term. And NASA was run by the US Air Force. It was military. The whole thing was military. So let's get away from this idea it was civilian. It wasn't civilian. There were civilians there, yes. But NASA was a military organization. It was created, NASA was actually created in 1958 by President Eisenhower in order to ensure that the Soviet Union didn't get upset by the overflight of various spy planes. The Soviet Union shot one down in May 1960, and Gary Powers, rather unfortunately, got hit by a surface-to-air missile. So they could only then use orbiting satellites. And that is how we know that photographic film is affected by the vacuum of space and has to be kept under pressure. Because there were 2 craft launched which used photographic film, unmanned craft. One was the Lunar Orbiter, launched in 1966, 1967, to go to the moon and photograph potential landing sites for Apollo. The other was the Hexagon Spy Satellite, which overflew the Soviet Union and was trying to see how many rockets they got, how many bombers they got, were they a threat? And both those craft used photographic film. I attended a lecture in London a couple of years ago, given by the designer of the Hexagon Spy Satellite camera system. And he said, quite openly, we had to keep the film and the cameras under pressure, otherwise they'd outgas. I thought, what? What's he talking about? Film, pressure, outgassing. And then I discovered, of course, film does outgas in a vacuum. And if you keep it under 1 pound per square inch pressure, now you can check this. You go onto the NASA website, you look at the Hexagon Spy Satellite. It's now been declassified about 7 or 8 years ago. Hence the talk was perfectly straightforward. But I picked up on the fact that film had to be kept under pressure. And I asked a question. I said, would the pressurization be required on Apollo? And he said, of course it would. Film outgasses in a vacuum. And that's where it all started. So we've got this new idea that film has to be kept under pressure. And we know it was not pressurized on the moon, because there's no evidence for it. There's no description of it. There are no photographs of pressurized cameras. There are only photographs of cameras which are not pressurized. Because I know what a Hasselblad camera looks like, and it looks very similar to the cameras used on the lunar surface. So you've got this anomaly. Photographic film cannot work in a vacuum, but some of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century were taken on the lunar surface, allegedly, showing men walking around there. No, they're not. They're walking around here on Earth. Of course they are. They couldn't take the pictures on the moon. The cameras wouldn't work. Over to you, NASA.
Well, certainly give me something to think about.
Right. Now, having said that, of course, digital cameras are not affected in nearly the same way.
Yeah.
A digital camera it will still take photographs because it has light-sensitive diodes, close-coupled device, CCDs, which record light on individual elements. It's a completely different system of recording light than a photographic film will record light. And all the Apollo pictures were taken on photographic film. They were subsequently scanned, which is why you can find them on the internet now. They've been scanned in, but they were originally photographic film. And that is a very key point. If people don't realize that, they're going to get the wrong end of the stick. Comparing it to digital images, which don't require pressurization, because it doesn't have volatile elements. Photographic film is comprised of a plastic backing with several layers of different light-sensitive material called emulsion. That's made originally from a liquid, and the volatile elements in that liquid will outgas, even when dried. That's why the film cannot work in a vacuum. So let's get past this idea that man has landed on the moon. He hasn't. He couldn't have done. He'd be dead. He certainly didn't take any pictures.
Yeah, I still can't get it out of my head. You know, I think I'll take a lot of convincing, but I mean, you've certainly given me a lot to think about, Marcus, as you have done in the past.
Okay.
I don't quite know what I mean, like you say yourself, I haven't got any access to NASA myself, so I can't actually prove or sort of question anything either way, really. Obviously you've done a lot of research into it, and what you say you can't really argue with, I've got to say.
Okay. Well, I've got no more access to NASA than you would have if you. I just chose.
You've actually chosen to study the actual landings themselves, and you found, to your belief, that they didn't happen. Okay. When we got to Apollo 13, when they were going to do the Apollo 13 mission, and that failed, and apparently they went around the moon and used the lunar lander to come back.
Yes, that's the story. That's probably correct, as far as anybody is prepared to believe it. But let's have a look at Apollo 13. If you look at the original specification for the flight of Apollo 13, which you can find online, it's all available, and you do the calculation of where they were going to land on the moon, allegedly, and what time they were going to land on the moon. And they were going to land there on April the 14th, 1970. They're taken off there for April the 11th. They're taken off. And if the mission had gone according to plan, no explosion, no dramas, if they'd landed, they would have landed in darkness. They got the calculation wrong. The actual location for the landing is called Frau Moreau, which is a particular area on the lunar surface, on the west side. If you look at the date and you use some of the current astronomy software, you can do the calculation. You can find out where Apollo 13 was supposed to land. In darkness. Forget it. It's not going to happen. You can't land a spacecraft in darkness. And that's why David Percy and Mary Bennett's book, Dark Moon, is called Dark Moon, because that's what it was if Apollo 13 had got there. Dark Moon.
Oh, that's another book to look out for. That's something I hadn't actually realised myself again.
It's something anybody can check. You get the original specification for the landing time and date, put it into a software astronomy software program, and you'll see it's beyond the Terminator, i.e. in darkness. Oh dear, they got that one.
So, I mean, what about the astronauts themselves? I mean, none have really come forward. I mean, I know we've had one or two instances where someone said something, or not said something, and they've been construed as to say, oh, well, they haven't been to the moon or whatever. But none's actually come forward and to say, to admit it.
No, because they won't. Look, all astronauts were technically military men, including Armstrong. He was Navy, flew for the Marines he flew in Korea, shot down 55 planes. He was a very good pilot. There's no doubt about that. Very good pilot. But he was all military. Now, if you're a military officer in the American services, you take oaths of secrecy. There are certain things which you can and cannot talk about. If your commander-in-chief gives you an order, and the order is to jump, you only have one question: how high, sir? The commander-in-chief is the president. If you're told that you're going to fly to the moon, but you're not actually going to go there, but you've got to persuade people that you have been there, yes, sir, of course I'll do that. National security. The honour of America is at stake. It's a matter of national security. You will do as you're told. Yes, sir, of course I will, would be the response. If they're told to do something, they do it. They don't question it. That's not what military people do. They don't question things. They do them.
I presume they choose the right people for that in the first place anyway.
Yes. They choose people who were good. I mean, most people, if you're interested in space travel, a lot of people can name most of the Apollo astronauts, or certainly the ones who allegedly walked on the moon, because they were very well known. They were promoted as the American heroes. It was the new frontier.
Yeah, apparently on the Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin was the lead astronaut, actually, wasn't he? He was the one that was supposed to have walked on first, but because they wanted to get him on film, coming down the stairs, allegedly.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about that, because in the Gemini program, which occurred before Apollo, which is the two-man craft, the module pilot of the Gemini craft was always the first one out. So Buzz Aldrin, being the lunar module pilot, thought, well, I'm going to be first on the moon. I shall be famous. Until he it was explained to him that no, he wasn't going to be first out. Armstrong was going to be first out, purely because of the design of the spacecraft. In the lunar lander, the bit they landed in, the two of them, in this case Armstrong and Aldrin, Armstrong stood on the left-hand side of the lunar lander, so you could look out, and Aldrin stood on the right-hand side of the lunar lander. They could both look out through their own windows, and the door through which they were going to exit was between them, and it was hinged on the left-hand side, which meant it opened, so Aldrin couldn't get past Armstrong to get out first. Armstrong had to get out to allow Aldrin to get out. That's why Armstrong was first on the moon. And the story, I've got no idea if it's true or not. Aldrin said, look, mate, if you're first out, I'm taking a photograph. And have you seen a photograph of Armstrong on the lunar surface?
Not to my knowledge.
No. No, you haven't. There is no photograph of Neil Armstrong. Well, there's one of his back view. It's part of a panorama. But there's no recognizable photograph of Armstrong on the lunar surface. So maybe he kept his promise.
Well, the famous photo you see is actually Buzz Aldrin, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, man on the moon. And he hasn't got a camera, has he? In that photograph?
No.
It's Armstrong who took the photograph.
Yeah.
A very good photograph.
Oh yes, it's superb, yeah.
Beautifully exposed, beautifully composed, slightly almost cut his head off, but not quite. But here's the point about those photographs. They were taken with a Hasselblad camera, as we've already mentioned. The Hasselblad camera that was used to take those photographs had no viewfinder. Because if you're wearing a spacesuit, you can't get your head down to look through the viewfinder on a Hasselblad, which is on top of the camera. So they took it away. There's no viewfinder. The shutter button on a Hasselblad is on the front of the camera. You can't see it from inside a spacesuit. So they made it bigger. But you're wearing armoured gauntlets. You can't wear half a spacesuit. You've got to wear the whole lot. So, how do you know you've pressed the shutter button? How do you know you've taken a photograph? was the only indicator. There's no sound in space, we're told. Of course, they weren't in space. They were here on Earth, but that's another story.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. Even with normal leather gloves on, you wouldn't want to want to be wearing gloves to take a normal photo, would you? Because it's hard to press the buttons. I can see exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
And usually you'd use a viewfinder. Right, you could take photographs without a viewfinder, but you would take lots and lots and lots of pictures to make sure you got the right one. And you can't tell if you've taken a photograph because the indicator, the indicator showing a photograph has been taken is on the side of the camera, which is also not visible from inside a spacesuit. So you don't know you've taken a photograph, you don't know if you pressed the shutter button, you can't use a viewfinder, and you've got to use manual control to focus it, to set the shutter speed, to set the aperture, and you're wearing armoured gauntlets. I don't think so. I think this is a complete fabrication, because some of those photographs show no indication of any false focusing. They're all correctly exposed, correctly composed, as if somebody's using a viewfinder. They're taken by professional photographers here on Earth. They're part of NASA's PR image to persuade the American public that they were spending their money wisely. Another fabrication. So, if anybody can prove me wrong when I say that no human has walked on the lunar surface, I want to hear it. Because I want to shut up and go away and do something else.
Yeah. I know, you've been doing it for a number of years, haven't you? And this is why your argument is so convincing. And it's very difficult to argue against you. Even though our mind has been, we've been bombarded with it basically ever since 69 basically, haven't we? Or before. And it's so ingrained in my head, for instance. I still, even though I'm hearing what you're saying, that it's not possible, I still can't help believing it was, you know. But you certainly give me something to think about, I know that.
Well, as I say, please try and prove me wrong. And if anybody in your worldwide audience can also prove me wrong, I want to hear about it. But what happens? I mean, I've said that when I've done previous interviews. I say similar things.
Yeah, you've been saying it for many years.
What is extraordinary is, instead of people coming along and saying, "You're a stupid bloody idiot, Marcus, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and this is the reason why," I get completely the reverse. I say, thank goodness somebody's talking about this, because I have believed for many years that this was the case, but I don't dare talk about it. So to hear you talk about it has given me great encouragement. And I've had people from all over the world contact me, from Australia, from New Zealand, from America, Canada. I'm working with people in Canada now, looking into all this. People in America, people in Europe, people in France, in Finland, in Thailand, in Russia. I mean, I've been on Russian television talking about it. Swiss television, German, French television. It's the same story. Nobody comes back and says, "Marcus, shut up, you're complete nonsense, this is why." They don't do.
I mean, do you ever speak to, it's probably a silly question, anyone from NASA itself? You've obviously spoken to NASA at a point. Can they not prove anything to you either?
No, because the only arguments they use. Now, what's interesting about NASA now is that there is nobody at NASA today, working at NASA today, who was working there in the late 1960s. All retired or gone to the great studio in the sky. Or they've moved on. People working at NASA today believe entirely in the story of Apollo, except we're now coming up against the real push point. President Trump has said we will return to the moon by 2024. So they're having to find out, people at NASA now, in order to return, it's called the Artemis program, that's Apollo's twin sister, the Artemis program, presumably going to be women on the moon, that it wasn't quite as easy as they've all been led to believe. They're finding out that in order to get to the moon, there are certain things which don't appear to have been done on Apollo. The first time that anybody tried, they're using something called the Orion craft. That was part of the Constellation program. It's one of the very few parts of the Constellation program. That was initiated by George Bush and cancelled by President Obama. The only thing that survived from it was the Orion capsule, into which the astronauts were supposed to go to the moon, or rather, they were supposed to go to Mars. Well, forget that. That'll never happen. So they're going to use it to go to the moon. And the only test that craft, the Orion craft, has had was in December 2014, when it was launched 3,500 miles out from Earth, and it came straight back again to test the heat shield. The heat shield nearly failed. There hasn't been another test of the Orion craft, because the heat shield material, you think they could just use the same they used on Apollo, dig out the old formula. It's called AVCOT 5061. Can't be that difficult. But apparently it is difficult. It almost failed. And they were also recording radiation levels, because they were going through the inner Van Allen radiation belt. The radiation levels were far higher than they had expected. What? Didn't they know on Apollo what the radiation levels were? Because they took readings, didn't they? It's like a couple of chest x-rays, we're told. No, it wasn't. This is what I mean when I say NASA is now finding out that they don't know enough to do what Apollo did, because Apollo didn't do it. Apollo was a fabrication.
Do you think they will have the capabilities to go through the Van Allen belts now?
Oh, flying through the Van Allen belts, yeah, they can actually get round them. I mean, they fly. If you leave Earth on a polar orbit, you can avoid the Van Allen belts. But the point is, if you leave Earth on a polar orbit, you'll never reach the moon, because you can't change direction. Spacecraft don't have steering wheels. It's Newton's first law of motion. An object will remain in motion until acted upon by an external force. The only external force you're going to have on a spacecraft is the engine, where you've got to take fuel. If you can't take enough fuel to change your course from a polar orbit, which is basically at 90 degrees to where the moon is, you've got a major problem. This is why when Apollo allegedly launched towards the moon, they were on an equatorial orbit. They launched out over Africa, went over India, South America, back to America, and launched out over the Pacific, where nobody could see them. Ah!
Yeah.
So all these things, they all start to add up after a while. But no, people at NASA now are beginning to realize that the stories they've been led to believe happened with Apollo were a fabrication. They were a deception. They were a fraud. And they're having to work from first, because they've got to work out what to do about the vacuum as well. And the vacuum is going to destroy anything in space. The vacuum is a very powerful force, especially if humans are involved.
So are you really thinking that they may not even get to the moon now, in 2023 or wherever it was?
Well, let's say that at the moment they haven't got a capsule in which they can travel. They haven't got spacesuits that are suitable for walking on the moon. They haven't got a lander that will land, and they haven't got a rocket that's been tested to take them up there. So, no, I don't think they're going to. I think it's going to be delayed and delayed again, and we need more money. We haven't got enough time. It's going to be all that. And President Trump is going to get very pissed off. He doesn't like incompetence. He'll say, look guys, you did it 9 times back in the 60s. What's the problem today? They say, oh, well, we didn't do it in the 60s. It was all to fool the Russians.
Yeah. Well, of course, the proof of the pudding will be if they do the future landings, they should be able to find all the left equipment that was from the original landing, shouldn't they? Yeah.
Oh, they found it already. They've got it. They've taken pictures of it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say that to you. They have found flags and things, haven't they? So they say. Or have they been planted, do you think, on the photos?
They haven't found any flags, by the way. The flags would have disappeared. The ultraviolet light would have destroyed it, and we know that, because the Russians put a flag outside their Mir spacecraft, space station.
Right.
And when Mir was going to be decommissioned, they said, "Well, better get the flag back in. We can't let that go." They went out, couldn't find it. It was the micrometeorites. It was the ultraviolet light. It basically destroyed it. So no flags on the moon. But they photographed the landers, we're told. Have you seen the pictures?
I've seen one or two things that are supposed to be remnants of things left on the moon. Yeah, but are you saying they've been falsified?
Of course they've been falsified. You can tell it. You can see it. Look. Okay. These photographs were taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009. Right? It was sent up. It was being orbited in the moon, photographing the surface for many years, and they brought it down from its normal orbit of 60 kilometers down to an orbit of 25 kilometers, it's about 15 miles above the lunar surface, to photograph what remained of all the Apollo landing sites. 15 miles. We're not talking very far. And what do you see in the photographs? You see a few little pixels, yellow, so a white pixel or black pixel with a whacking great arrow, which NASA has conveniently put on there saying Apollo 11 lander, Apollo 12, or they can all. I've heard of Photoshop. I know what Photoshop can do. These images are Photoshopped. And the reason I say that is quite straightforward. If you look, which is easy to find, a photograph taken by an orbiting satellite above Earth, it's called a GEO-I-1 satellite, it's taking colour images, these are all black and white, these landing site images, it takes colour images from 600 kilometres above the Earth, 400 miles through the dust and pollution and distortion of the Earth's atmosphere, and you can see your own car sat outside your house. You can see which way the car's pointing. In my presentation, I use an illustration of the London Eye, which anybody doesn't know is a Ferris wheel with cars on it, which people can travel in. It's very impressive. I've been on it. Next to it is a car park where people have put their cars when they go on the London Eye. And you can see if the car's got a sunroof, so you know which car's pointing. You see what colour the car is.
Yeah, I've seen my place from Google, and you can see the cars that's parked, Yeah,
you can see it. So, and it's in colour. And the resolution on the GEO-I-1 satellite is the same resolution as we're told was used on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter cameras. These are 21st century cameras on which you can see absolutely nothing. Absolutely. It's only because you have an arrow saying Apollo 11 that you know what you're supposed to be looking at. It could be a rock. Could be anything. Or it could be fabrication using Photoshop. And there are people who've done the research into looking at it, because you can tell if a photograph or if any image has been photoshopped. There are programs you can use to identify the actual Photoshop series number. And these are all photoshopped. NASA, sorry, you're still living up to your old name, never a straight answer.
I mean,
get a grip.
So before we did the show, we actually mentioned Ken Johnson, didn't we? Well, I did to you. I asked you if you'd heard of him. And he was a NASA whistleblower, because he was actually asked to actually fake photos for NASA, and he said he wouldn't do it. And he actually came out and, basically he left NASA. He didn't actually work. He wasn't actually in the military there. He was a contractor, I believe, working on the NASA project. But he was actually sent into a lab and asked to actually fake photographs, and he said he wouldn't do it, or rub things out. I think were more to the point.
Yes, there's supposed to be things in photographs which are airbrushed out or removed from the photo.
That's one thing. I mean, we do hear about UFOs and things being spotted from the space station. I mean, what do you think about that? And do you think that they do airbrush these things out?
I think they do, because if something is seen, taken, say, from the cameras on the space station, and the space station, by the way, for anybody else, is real, it's there, it exists, there are people on it. So there's not an argument about that.
Well, you can see it, can't you?
Yes, I've seen it a couple of times. You know, if the sun's in the right position, shining underneath it, you can see it going over. I've seen the International Space Station going over. It's quite an impressive sight. I've seen it when I was in India, flying over the Himalayas. That was quite an impressive sight too. If something is photographed from the International Space Station, which is quite definitely, visibly, not from this Earth, because of the way it's constructed, the way it's flying, the way it's moving, questions are going to be asked. So, obviously, these questions cannot be asked because a lot of individuals will not be willing to answer them, because they probably don't know what the answer is. But if it is so obvious that it is something which can maneuver and move in a way that no human constructed craft can do, yeah, we've got a problem. We've got a major problem. And I don't think the governments are in a position at the moment to publicly discuss it. There is some talk at the moment that there is going to be an article, or there has been an article in the New York Times, which is going to reveal certain aspects of disclosure. I don't believe a word of it. I think it's a continuation of the, just keep them interested, but keep them fooled.
I mean, I think there has been an aspect of disclosure already, because they did release thousands of files, didn't they? And we did as well in this country. And there are lots of gems. I've said it before on this show. There are lots of gems in these files, but you've got to look for them. You know, it's like looking for a tree in a wood. You know, it's just a matter of actually looking for all this stuff. Taking the time. But
yes, because they're not going to point you in the direction that you would like to go.
No, they'll just give you thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and say, have a look through that lot. And there's just a few lines in there that are really telling, actually, about UFOs that are quite interesting.
Exactly.
And of course, they gave it a different name as well. They started calling it UAPs instead of UFOs. So anyone asking for UFO disclosure, now you should be asking for UFO and UAP disclosure.
Yeah. Maybe it's time to set Nick Pope loose and get him looking at something he was supposed to be investigating when he was at the Ministry of Defence.
Well, surprisingly, Nick's saying more now than he's ever said. He seems to be trickling a little bit more of his own beliefs out, I think, rather than saying giving secrets away. There's nothing against him giving his own opinions, is there? And he seems to be doing that more nowadays.
Well, he's probably been asked about it so often that he felt that the least he can do is to actually inform people honestly with what he was finding out when he was working there.
Because, I mean, obviously everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and you're not giving any secrets away by doing that. But,
no, you're not. Not doing anything at all. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, because these things can't be kept secret forever.
Mm.
Eventually, papers will be released, photographs will appear that are irrefutably not of this earth, or of an object not of this earth, and people will ask questions, because with the access we have now with the internet, the photograph, everybody carries a camera with them nowadays on their phone. Eventually, questions are going to be asked, which will have to be answered, because in the same way about Apollo, sort of question I'm asking now is asking 25 years ago. And that's before the days of the internet. And so things have moved on very fast. There are a considerable amount of new information that comes out all the time. There are people working on the whole Apollo story now, almost full time, right around the world. There are people putting stuff out there. Anybody interested, there's a YouTube channel called Apollo Detectives. You can go on there and see some very interesting films from different people, some from myself, some from other people who've done the research. You go to a website called Aulis, A-U-L-I-S, aulis.com. That's got some of the most remarkable articles, some from Russian scientists, filmmakers. There's also a film which you can see, it's on the Apollo Detectives YouTube channel. It's called Make Believe, Smoke and Mirrors. It's a long film, but it explains exactly how this whole deception was created. It's looking at the Apollo film record. the film record, not the stills image record, the film record. How was it done? And if anybody who's worked in the film business will have heard of something called an optical printer. An optical printer is what the name says. It prints optics, i.e. bits of film, in the same way that a photocopier copies sheets of paper. You can do different sizes. An optical printer can produce film at different sizes, at different speeds. Because it's a very complex thing. It's not simple, just slow motion stuff. There are 7 different film speeds identified in the Apollo film record. A lot of it is models. A lot of it is miniatures. And those are identified because of the way in which they move.
Well.
So once you start looking into the detail of it, let's say Make-Believe Smoke and Mirrors, when it was originally produced about 5 years ago, the narrator of it disguised his voice so he couldn't be recognised, because he's apparently quite a well-known filmmaker. He disguised his voice so well he couldn't understand what he was saying. Somebody has now identified what was being said and has dubbed on a new commentary to the film. So that's on the Apollo Detectives website. So anybody who's really interested, check it out. Because there's one major giveaway in the whole thing which shows that it was not filmed on the moon, it was filmed here on Earth. The one thing you can't change is the speed at which objects fall here on Earth. And we know that on the moon the gravity is 1/6 that of gravity on Earth, so objects will fall much slower on the moon than they would here on Earth. But the one thing you can't put on a wire and affect is the sand of the surface, or the dirt, or the regolith of the lunar surface. And if you look at any of the astronauts who are kicking a piece of, some dirt, they're jumping up in the air. There's one famous sequence of what's called the flag salute. And if you look at the astronaut's foot, you can see that as he jumps up, he pulls a load of sand up with him. The sand then immediately falls back to Earth, because it is Earth, and he doesn't. Because any 2 objects in space, or any 2 objects on the Earth, will fall at the same speed. They don't. The astronaut is much slower, because they couldn't put bits of sand on a wire. So they hope nobody would notice. We have noticed. We know it's fake. We know it's fraudulent. We know it's a deception. NASA, you have been found out. It's game over. Forget it. Go back to work.
Well, on that note, if anyone would like to email you, have you got an email address they can?
No, please do. There are 2 easy ways to do it. Go onto the Aulis website, aulis.com. Go onto the contact button and address it. Or you go onto nexusmagazine.com, contact button. Or you can email me direct at nexus.magazine@bt internet. I always forget it. btinternet.com. Or is it BT Connect?
I'll put all the links up on the page though, Marcus.
Okay.
That's the Facebook page of Paranormal Dimensions. It's been fascinating having you on the show. The time has gone so quick. I didn't realise that, we've over 2.5 hours we've been talking, and it's actually gone so fast. It's ridiculous. We did have a chat a little bit before the show anyway, but
that's true. But no, it's fascinating because the sort of questions you're putting, the points you're making, allow me to give you the good answers. Yeah. Because there are good answers.
The trouble was, I'm actually struggling to find questions because, as I say, I haven't got access to actual NASA itself, so I can only think of, and that is why I was going along the, trying to go back in time, going back to Roswell and everything like that, and then trying to think about how they could have done it with reverse engineering or something like that, But
exactly.
But I think you've sort of persuaded me that probably that didn't even happen either.
Let's just say that there were many people involved in what I call it is the Apollo deception.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly given me something to think about. and I'm sure everyone out there will have something to think about as well. And hopefully you'll get some emails and some interesting emails and perhaps you'll get back to me and let me know what they say. Or if I get anything, I'll pass it on to you.
Oh, well, I'd be delighted to hear it. In fact, anybody who's got anything to say, whether it's a positive contribution to say, look, I worked on this and I know that what you said about this is correct because of this. If it's people saying you're a complete idiot, Marcus, forget it, you don't know what you're talking about. Basically, I'll just junk it because I don't like ad hominem attacks. I don't like arguments from authority.
No.
That is not a decent argument. You've got to have a decent argument.
No. I mean, I do remember the late 60s. I worked in the military electronics field, and I can remember the change from, sudden change from valves to suddenly you starting using these little transistors. So I do know they were making quite intricate stuff back then. But obviously nothing like you would actually need to, to miniaturise it to get into spacecraft. I was making things for Phantoms and things like that. Communication units, so they were very compact, communication units, like the size of a couple of cigarette packets put together.
Sure.
So they were making small stuff like that. But, and I'm talking about 1967, 68, that sort of time period.
But it's interesting. There's some people now who are doing some really very interesting research into it. There's a guy called Randy Walsh in Canada, who's in Toronto. He's written one book called The Apollo Moon Missions: Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Right. Randy's claim to fame on this is that he's a commercial pilot. He can pilot aircraft, so he knows about navigation, and that was first attracted him to. I think he heard, I don't know if it was me talking or somebody talking about it. He said, well, I wonder how they navigate it. Because going to the moon, all right, you can see it, but how do you get there? Is it dead reckoning? Is it just luck? Do you just point yourself at the moon or where the moon's going to be in 3 days' time and hope you arrive? How do you think you've done it? And what sort of computers did they use to confirm all this? And he made some remarkable discoveries that the computer, called the Apollo Guidance Computer, the AGC, it doesn't have a memory, so it doesn't know where it is at any given time in space. Yeah. It is not an autonomous computer. Now, if you understand how you need to navigate across distance, which Randy does, he's made some very, very powerful points that NASA didn't know what the hell they were doing, because the computer system they were using, and there's another guy who's an electronics engineer working with aircraft. He lives in France, and he goes by the name of Hunchbacked on YouTube. And he's examined these computers they allegedly use to navigate, and he said, they won't work. I know how computers work. These don't. They couldn't have done it. It's a joke. The whole thing is a complete fabrication. So you've got people who understand about computers, people who understand about navigation, saying the same thing. It's fake. There's just no truth behind it. There's another author in the UK called Trevor Weaver, who's on his third book now. It's called Man on the Moon, Fact or Fiction. That's his first book. An important investigation into the Apollo moon landings. And he started off by wanting to prove to himself and his family that it happened. He heard all these ridiculous stories from people like me. Oh, it didn't happen. He said, no, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I'm going to prove they did happen. But the more he investigated, the more he found they couldn't have happened. And he's now written, he's on his third book now. They didn't happen. The moon landings were a fake. Fabrication is a deception. Because they couldn't have happened. The rockets couldn't have got there. Certainly the lunar rover couldn't have done what we're told it did. I say couldn't have got there because it couldn't navigate there. All right. We haven't covered Apollo 13. It was one of the questions you asked originally. What happened on Apollo 13? And I got into all the business about the landing site being in darkness, which it was, or would have been if they'd landed. They didn't land. So what happened? Okay. I said Apollo 13 launched on April the 11th, 1970. It was a Saturday, as it happened. The next day, Sunday, April the 12th, the Soviet Navy were doing naval exercises in the Bay of Biscay, off the coast of France and Spain. And quite by chance, they happened across this Apollo command module floating in the Atlantic. So they hauled it on board and took it back to their base at Murmansk. And 6 months later, the US sent a Coast Guard cutter called the South Wind to collect it, which it did. There are photographs of this bloody command module sat in the dock at Murmansk and on the front deck of the US Coast Guard cutter South Wind. So we know it existed. What the hell was it doing in the Bay of Biscay?
Wow. Yeah.
Where it hadn't been reported missing. Now, the official story of this Apollo command module is it was a boilerplate. A boilerplate. It looks exactly like the real thing. It's got the words NASA stenciled on it. It was used for practice, getting astronauts in and out when they landed on their parachutes. They need to practice getting in and out, and it was similar to it was the same size, obviously, as the real command module, but this was just for practice. What the hell was it doing in the Bay of Biscay? We know it was in the Bay of Biscay. The Soviet Navy collected it. Thanks very much. And they handed it back to America. Having had a good look at it, it's now on display outside the Grand Rapids Museum in Michigan. But you can't look inside it. It's been sealed till 2076.
Oh.
Which is the 300th anniversary of the founding of America.
That'll be way past our time, won't it, Marcus?
It'll be past our time. I shall probably come back as a crushed tomato or something. But the real Apollo 13, the real command module for Apollo 13, apparently, is at the Kansas Cosmodrome. So anybody listening in Kansas, go and have a look at it and tell me if you think it's real. And you can tell if it's real or not. Depends how much of the heat shield has been burnt away.
Yeah.
And if there's none burnt away, then it didn't fly in space. So what was this thing doing floating in the Atlantic? NASA don't talk about it very much, or they try to dismiss it as being a boilerplate, but they didn't report it missing. You'd think there's something as important as that. Oh, it fell off the side of a ship. Oh, somebody will find it. Don't worry about it. If it fell off the side of a ship in Florida, it's gone 2,000 miles across the Atlantic to the Bay of Biscay. And if it had been floating in the water for however long it would take, 6-8 weeks, you'd think there'd be some marine growth on it, like barnacles and such like. No, none of that. It's as if it fell off the ship today. Could it have been the actual Apollo 13 command module? That the Apollo 13 mission didn't actually get out of Earth orbit, or didn't even get into Earth orbit, and it went off course, and it had to ditch, because the Bay of Biscay is at least 1,500 miles north of the official launch trajectory, which would pass over Mauritania. Bay of Biscay is quite a long way from Mauritania. It's as if if it was the real Apollo 13, then we got a real problem on our hands here. Because we're told it went around the back of the moon and everybody prayed and it all got back and everybody was happy. And there's a lot of questions to ask about how the hell they survived.
I think I stayed up all night that night.
Yeah, no, it was a great piece of Hollywood scriptwriting, wasn't it? Sorry, I'm being very cynical.
No,
here.
I mean, you certainly opened up a lot of questions, certainly for me, and I shall be looking further into it. I hope a lot of people are not feeling too disappointed out there listening to this. It's kind of took the wind out of my sails a little bit, but at the same time, I'm a great believer in the truth anyway, and if that's what the truth is, then that's what the truth is,
Exactly. Yeah, you can't say fairer than that. It's now been released onto YouTube. There's a film called American Moon.
American Moon. Right.
American Moon. It's by an Italian filmmaker who's also a photographer, and he's put together probably the most impressive piece of filmmaking about the whole Apollo missions. He shows professional photographers, people who worked for high fashion magazines like Vogue, Vanity Fair, Elle. He shows them the photographs taken on the moon and asks them for their opinion about it. And well, you can see where the light source is. You can see where the reflectors have been put. These weren't taken on the moon. These are fake. This is professional photographers looking at it. And he goes into considerable detail about all the Apollo story that we're told. It's a very impressive and professional piece of filmmaking. American Moon. Massimo Mazzucco is the name of the guy who put it together.
Right. Well, so you asked me to search out. I'll see if I can put as many links as I can out on the page. Well, the David Percy's film, What Happened on the Moon, that was produced in 1999, and it's still one of the most, it's probably the definitive film explaining the problems with Apollo. So, what happened on the moon? I think there's a few internet sites out there, aren't there, as well, like YouTube sites, apart from the ones you've mentioned that talk about the Apollo landings being faked. I think there's a few of them out there.
It's interesting. Quite a few of most of my presentations are filmed by people who run them, not by me necessarily, and they usually post on the internet. A lot were taken down just before the 50th anniversary. Right. Several of my films were taken off the internet. They're being put back again now, but they were taken off then. It's as if NASA didn't want people to see the other side of their story, the dark side of Apollo.
Yeah, because people would have been, for the 50th anniversary, I suppose more people would have been doing searches and things, yeah.
Yes, they would. And in fact, I saw the two films that came out around that time, this is about a year ago. One was called First Man, which is a story of Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, I've got the book of that.
And all that. Yeah, it's a very good book. And what's interesting about the book, it's written by a good journalist called James Hansen. Not the climate change chap, somebody else. And the book goes into very great detail about Neil Armstrong's flying career, up to the point he joins NASA. He was actually asked by NASA to apply as an astronaut. When you start looking into the detail of his time at NASA and his time on Apollo 11, the detail is remarkably sparse relative to the detail that describes his flying career. It's almost as if he didn't actually want to take part, though he did get his cooperation. It's strange. There's some very strange stories about Neil Armstrong. You know, why he basically disappeared. He was considered to be a recluse. He was the first bloody man on the moon. He was as famous as Charles Lindbergh, first man to fly the Atlantic solo. Now, Neil Armstrong died in 2012. Where's he buried? One of the most famous Americans around. You'd think he'd be buried in the Arlington National Cemetery. It's where American heroes are buried. In fact,
there was a few astronauts who had mental problems, weren't there, after the turn to drink and or turn to cause religion or whatever.
Yeah, several did. It's a very good defence mechanism, that one. Neil Armstrong's buried at sea.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, off the coast of Florida.
I didn't know that.
He didn't want to fuss. Buzz Aldrin is still around. Michael Collins is still around. They were the crew members of Apollo 11. I think there's only about half the moonwalkers are still alive. Ed Mitchell's died.
John Young, I think he's still around.
Yes. Now, here's your starter for 10. Who were the 3 Apollo astronauts who flew twice to the moon?
If you put the Apollo 8 would have been, are you talking about round the moon or through the moon?
No, orbiting the moon. Flew either to orbit or land. 3 of the Apollo astronauts went twice.
Oh, put me on the spot there, haven't you? Wasn't
Well, Gene Cernan was one. It's Apollo 10 and 17.
right?
John Young.
Oh yeah, John. That's right. Yeah, I knew John Young was one of them. And wasn't it? Oh God, what's his name? I can't think of his name.
Jim Lovell.
The one from Apollo 8. Yeah.
Yeah, he was Apollo 8 and Apollo 13, aka Tom Hanks.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, both times he didn't land, did he?
Yeah, it was such a good story they made a film about it. Twice. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Yeah, you got Capricorn 1 as well, haven't you? Which is
That's a very good film, actually, and it's in line with quite a lot of the other films that come out of Hollywood, because you'll quite often find because Hollywood and the American government work very closely together. If the American government want information put out, but not as if it's from the American government, they use Hollywood to tell the story. So the film of Capricorn 1, which starred Telly Savalas, and O.J. Simpson was one, James Brolin. It's a good thriller. It's a good film. But it could well be what would happen if the Apollo astronauts were not on the Saturn V craft, which took off, and the Saturn V craft destroyed itself, exploded, and you've now got 3 astronauts who should be dead but aren't. So what do you do with them? Well, you've got to kill them. That was basically the premise of the film Capricorn 1. And it's how they managed to evade capture and being killed and turned up at their own funerals.
Yeah. Yeah, like you say, they do put the things right out in your face. I think a lot of things are put right out, aren't they? But the secret cabal, apparently, do a lot of this. Which is a whole other show.
Yes, obviously not so secret anymore because everybody knows about it.
Well, yeah, but a lot of it's not so secret, but unfortunately a lot of people still get taken in by it, don't they? And it's only like the small percentage of people, such as you and myself. You know, I'm not saying we're anything special, but we do actually realise that they're putting it out there in front of us for us to see, but other people just don't see it. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. It's the old story, because if they did see it, if they did agree that they're being manipulated and that they're being told certain things which aren't true, if you suddenly realise that, it's like saying, well, the moon landings didn't happen. Well, I know they didn't happen. I can prove it. But if everybody came to that conclusion, the next question would be, well, if they lied to us about that, what else have they lied to us about?
Yeah.
And that's a problem. That's a major problem.
Yeah, I think they're getting caught out with a lot of different things now anyway, aren't they, with different things?
Yes, they are. You know, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, started the Vietnam War in 1964. That was complete fabrication. American warships were not attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. It didn't happen. Now, there's a piece of trivia here. The commander of the American Naval Task Force of the Gulf of Tonkin was a guy by the name of Admiral George Morrison. Who was his son? Jim Morrison of the Doors.
I didn't realise that.
Yep. There are pictures of them together. So, there's an interesting stories on the links between the intelligence services and the music industry. Basically the hippie movement starting in the early 1960s. It's almost as if it's been started deliberately in the form that we know it now. Oh, there were some very talented musicians around, but many of them lived in the same place. A place called Laurel Canyon, north of Los Angeles. There's some very strange connections there. Certainly worth looking into, and there's a good series on that by a guy called Dave McGowan, and his website is Center for an Informed America. Get it, CIA?
No, I think there was a lot of certainly a lot of secret coded messages in a lot of the music. Even today, I believe that's the case. But as I say, that's a whole other program. That is. But,
yes. Yeah, there's some very interesting stories around. Some of it just put out to publicise people, some are put out because they're true, and some are just discounted because nobody can quite bring themselves to believe them.
Yeah. Anyway, what with lockdown and everything, Marcus, you obviously haven't been able to go out and do your touring and talking and things. Did you have anything planned this year?
Yeah, I did. It had to be cancelled. I was going to be talking up in East Anglia.
Where I live.
It's the group you mentioned. Was East Anglia UFO
that
group?
Yeah, I know. With Tony Buck.
Yeah. Yes. I was going to do that, and there were going to be a couple of other ones as well. But yeah, they all got cancelled, so I think we got a very good substitute.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you'll do it anyway at some point, because, next year, hopefully next year, it's just postponed, not cancelled.
No, just postponed. It's a matter of, people inviting me to do it. I'm very willing to travel, because I can charge to travel up to my tax bill. Yeah. I'm happy to do it. In fact, I like doing it because you get to meet people face to face. Sometimes you get some quite angry people.
I'm sure.
It's a matter of, what is it that I've done that's upset somebody so much? I've destroyed their dream.
Well, yeah, but you've only given... the thing is, as I said at the beginning of the show, everyone's entitled to their own opinions. And, and if you make that opinion, it's a free country. It's free, it's supposed to be free speech. I think that's changing quite a bit now, but,
yeah.
But, I think everyone's entitled to their own opinions, and really, you put out a good case. And it's a case that's, like you say, someone should be able to come back with a good argument for.
Well, I hope they do. It's what I always say. Please come back with a good argument. If you're an astronaut, or if you know an astronaut, if you know somebody who's worked close enough to the manufacturers or the testing people, and you can say, no, vacuum isn't so much of a problem. Of course the rocket can do it. The spacesuits can do what they say they can. I want to hear that, because if I'm saying things which are incorrect, I want to be corrected. Yeah. And in 25 years, I think I've only been corrected once. I was talking about the insulation on the command module. And I said that as it enters the Earth's atmosphere, at 25,000 miles an hour, it generates an enormous amount of heat. How did it not melt? Because the heat generated was vastly higher than the melting point of aluminium, which is what the craft is made of. So why did it not melt? And what about those grab handles on the outside of the command module? Why didn't they get melted off? I still haven't had an answer on that, but I was corrected on some of the construction techniques of the command module. It was constructed in a way that I hadn't fully taken into account. So from that point of view, that's the only thing I can think of that somebody's corrected me on.
They're very valid points, yeah.
Well, it's certainly valid points. And, as far as the camera is concerned, I'm fully familiar with how that all worked. I'm fully familiar with film. I'm fully familiar with the effect of vacuum on film and the vacuum effect of space. And also, as we said at the beginning, altitude sickness is basically a lack of pressure. And yet, the Apollo astronauts spent several days in a pressurized environment, which was the same as standing on the top of Mount Everest. They'd be dead. They wouldn't be surviving in that environment for 8 days, 12 days. Not real, not going to happen. And the craft couldn't generate the amount of pressure to keep them alive. It was not designed to. It's as if they didn't know what the hell they were doing. Well, they knew what they were doing, but they weren't going to send any astronauts to the moon.
Well, on that, Marcus, I think we're going to have to shut it down. we did try to shut it down about 20 minutes ago, but we started off again. But it's been fantastic talking to you, Marcus, and I hope to get to see you again at some point.
I shall look forward to it.
Maybe we'll get to Manchester again next year. It was cancelled this year, wasn't it? But
yes, it was.
Hopefully things will settle down and we'll get back to normal. Although I'm beginning to doubt it.
Well, let's see what happens. The future is another country.
Yeah.
But it's good. Thank you very much, David.
No, it's been fantastic having you on, Marcus, and I really appreciate you taking the time and taking the evening out to talk to me and talk to everyone out there. And I'm sure everyone out there would have found it very interesting and fascinating. You probably upset a few people.
Well, if I upset you, tell me about it. Don't keep it to yourself.
Exactly.
I want to hear.
Right.
What?
And as I say, I'll put anything I can find to do with the moon or the fake moon landings on the Paranormal Dimensions site on Facebook. If you want to send me any links or anything, Marcus, please do. I'll put your email address and everything on it. And
right, sure. I shall send you a list of links which I think might be appropriate.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, be good at that.
Anyway, cheers, Marcus. Take care of yourself, and speak to you again soon. Yeah,
I hope so. Thanks, David. I will indeed.
Cheers. Thanks again. Thanks a lot. Bye. You've been listening to Paranormal Dimensions. I'm David Young on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thanks for listening, and hope you found that interesting. It's fantastic. Good night, and tune in again next week.
Paranormal Dimensions is as bright and powerful as our celestial star, the sun. And although it's expending thousands of pounds of energy every minute of the day, have no fear. There's plenty left.
Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.